Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is the place where we quiet the noise, slow down and let history speak softly. Whether you're winding down before sleep, cooking, working with headphones on, or simply letting your restless thoughts settle, this is long-form storytelling made to calm your mind. Here we don't speculate wildly. We practice soft science, archaeology, climate, genetics, anthropology, and we admit when we don't have all the answers. This channel is about humble science told slowly, because the truth is already strange enough. And if, somewhere along the way, you happen to drift off, don't worry. I place timestamps in the description, so the next day you can pick up exactly where you left the story. Every chapter is worth hearing, all the way to the end. If you find value in this, if you believe the world deserves more calm, thoughtful science, I'd be grateful if you hit like and subscribe. You can even share with me how you use these stories. Do you listen before bed, while driving, or maybe while showering? Or tell me where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know. This is an episode close to my heart. 4 years ago, I visited GÖBEKLI TEPE in person. As a history nerd, it was one of the most extraordinary days of my life. And tonight, I get to share that story with you. So settle in. Let's go back, before cities, before farming, to a hill in southeastern Turkey that has forced us to rewrite almost everything we thought we knew about the beginning of civilization. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. There are places on Earth that look like nothing. Gentle mounds of dirt, featureless ridges, the kind of landscape you could pass 1,000 times and never think twice about. GÖBEKLI TEPE was one of those places. For generations, the local farmers of southeastern Turkey knew the hill. They called it the Potbelly Hill, GÖBEKLI TEPE in Turkish, because its shape was round and slightly bulging from the flat horizon. For them it was simply land to be worked. Its stones were useful for building field walls, its slopes were good for grazing sheep. Nothing about it looked remarkable. It was just another bump in the countryside near the village of Öğrenci, but history has a way of hiding itself in plain sight. Sometime in the early 1990s, a Kurdish farmer named Şeref Yıldız was clearing stones from his field when he noticed one unlike the others. It was too well shaped, too smooth, as though carved rather than broken. He pointed it out to others in the village, and soon the Şanlıurfa Museum took notice. For a while, though, nothing much happened. Archaeological surveys in the 1960s had already passed over the site. A team of American and Turkish archaeologists had walked the hill back in 1963, noted some flints and odd stone fragments, and moved on. They saw nothing that suggested a major discovery. That forgetfulness lasted for more than 30 years, until a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to Turkey. Schmidt was looking for a new site to study after years working at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, another pre-Pottery Neolithic settlement that had been lost to the rising waters of the Ataturk Dam. In 1994 he visited GÖBEKLI TEPE, guided by locals who knew about the strange carved stones lying on the surface. Where others had seen nothing, Schmidt's instincts told him this was extraordinary. The carved limestone fragments, the flint scatters, the peculiar shape of the hill itself. It was enough for him to sense something unique was hidden beneath the soil. What he began to uncover would soon change archaeology forever. Beneath the dusty slopes were not just stones, but massive carved pillars, taller than any human and arranged in great circular enclosures. They were carved into the shape of a T, flat at the top, upright, like the body of a person. On their surfaces were foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, vultures, animals rendered in relief with astonishing skill. These pillars had been buried deliberately, covered with tons of backfill until only the rounded hill remained. No one expected a site like this to exist. The oldest monumental architecture known up to that point was several thousand years younger. The revelation was almost unbearable for the field of archaeology. A temple on a hill that predated cities, predated writing, even predated farming itself. It seemed to invert the established order of human history. Klaus Schmidt called GÖBEKLI TEPE a supernova, a blinding eruption of significance that rewrote what was thought possible in the Stone Age. Yet what he and his team found was not myth, not legend, but carved stone, stratigraphy, radiocarbon samples and layers of prehistoric labour. The hill that had looked so ordinary to farmers turned out to conceal the oldest known monumental sanctuary in the world. The story of Göbekli Tepe quickly became almost mythic in its own right. Newspaper headlines announced it as the world's first temple. Documentaries breathlessly declared that human civilization had begun not with farming, but with ritual. And yet, for all the hype, the story is still one of careful, painstaking science. Archaeologists move slowly, 1 square metre at a time, brushing dirt from carved foxes, lifting fragments of obsidian blades, cataloguing beads of limestone. This was not a revelation delivered in an instant. It was a rediscovery that would unfold for decades, with each excavation season bringing new questions rather than final answers. What makes Göbekli Tepe so compelling is not only its age but its deliberate concealment. The enclosures were not destroyed by erosion or war. They were filled in on purpose, sealed beneath thousands of tons of rubble. This backfilling preserved the carvings in astonishing condition, almost as if someone wanted them kept safe for future eyes. But why bury something that took so much labour to build? Was it a ritual closure, a way of ending one cycle of belief before beginning another? Or was it simply practical, reusing space for new constructions? Archaeology has no final answer. What we know is only this. The hill that looked like nothing was in fact a library of memory, a place where the earliest known monumental art of humankind had been entombed. Klaus Schmidt dedicated the last 20 years of his life to Göbekli Tepe. He passed away in 2014, but the project continues under the German Archaeological Institute and Turkish authorities. His vision was to see beyond the easy headlines, beyond calling it merely the first temple. He argued that Göbekli Tepe represented a new stage in human symbolic life, a place where communities gathered, where beliefs were materialized in stone, and where social complexity began to emerge in ways not easily explained by older models of farming-first archaeology. He was careful to avoid exaggeration, but he was also unafraid to admit wonder. To walk among the enclosures today, sheltered under the great protective roof built to preserve them, is to feel something difficult to put into words. The stones are taller than people. Their surfaces ripple with carvings of animals once dangerous, once sacred, perhaps once both. Standing at their centre, you cannot help but ask, who built this? Why here? Why then? The fact that no definitive answers exist only deepens the impact. It forces humility, reminding us that human history is not a straight line, but a labyrinth. The rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe also transformed how archaeologists think about the broader region. The hill is not alone. Over the past decades, more than a dozen similar sites have been identified in southeastern Turkey, often called the Taş Tepeler or Stone Hills. Together they suggest a wider cultural phenomenon, of which Göbekli Tepe is only the most famous. The discovery in the 1990s did not just give us a single site. It opened an entire landscape of prehistoric architecture, pushing back the horizons of what Stone Age communities could achieve. And yet the irony remains. None of this would have come to light if a farmer had not stumbled on carved stones while clearing his field. If not for that simple act, perhaps Göbekli Tepe would still be just a potbelly hill, anonymous among thousands of others across Anatolia. The modern encounter with the deep past began with local knowledge, with curiosity, with the recognition that a stone was too smooth, too deliberate, too strange to be natural. So why was it that a farmer, and not an archaeologist, first noticed the secret of the hill? Perhaps because archaeology often looks for the spectacular, in places already famous, while history often hides in the mundane. Perhaps because it takes someone who works the land daily to notice when the land is hiding something unusual. Whatever the reason, it is a reminder that science is not about lone geniuses, but about collaborations. Between villagers and scholars, between past and present, between the earth and those who listen to it carefully. The story of Göbekli Tepe begins not with the Neolithic, not with farming or cities, but with a rediscovery in our own lifetimes. A farmer, a forgotten survey, a German archaeologist with a hunch, and a hill that turned out not to be a hill at all but a monument deliberately buried for thousands upon thousands of years. That is where the mystery starts. What we do with it, how we interpret it, how we fit it into the story of humanity is still unfolding. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: How many other hills that look like nothing might in fact be hiding pieces of history we cannot yet imagine? If a potbelly mound in southeastern Turkey can hold the oldest known sanctuary on Earth, then what other stories remain underfoot, invisible until someone stoops to look more closely? The rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that the ground beneath us is never silent. It carries memory, waiting for the moment when curiosity and patience align to hear it speak. And so this hill that should not exist, this hill that was supposed to be empty, continues to force us to rethink not only the beginnings of civilization, but the way we find history itself. It tells us that sometimes the past waits quietly for us to notice, and that when we finally do, the silence can be louder than anything else we have ever known. Why was a hill that held some of the most extraordinary carvings of the Stone Age ignored for more than 3 decades? That question is as much about archaeology as it is about Göbekli Tepe itself. The site was never truly hidden. Farmers knew the mound, they pulled flint and limestone blocks from its slopes every planting season, and archaeologists even recorded it once in the mid-20th century. Yet for 30 years nothing happened. The stones remained where they were, the mound unexcavated, the story untold. Only in the 1990s did the world finally look more closely, and only then did we realise that beneath the soil lay pillars carved and set in place nearly 12,000 years ago. The first professional eyes to fall on the hill belonged to a joint team of American and Turkish archaeologists in 1963. This was not an excavation, but part of a broad surface survey across southeastern Anatolia. Their goal was to catalogue prehistoric sites in advance of development projects in the region. When they reached Göbekli Tepe, they noted the flint scatters and limestone fragments, describing it as a possible Byzantine cemetery or perhaps a modest prehistoric site. They wrote their notes, marked it on a map, and moved on. For them it was just one mound among many. The paperwork was filed, but no excavation followed. That moment of neglect would shape the site's fate for decades. The surveyors were not incompetent, they were simply looking through the lens of their time. In the 1960s, archaeologists expected the great transitions of prehistory to follow a particular sequence. First came the domestication of plants and animals, then permanent villages, and only later monumental structures. Nothing in the established timeline suggested that a hill in rural Turkey could conceal architecture from before the agricultural revolution, and so the possibility was never entertained. Göbekli Tepe was left to the farmers once again. For 30 years the mound remained quiet. Local people continued to clear stones for their fields, sometimes finding fragments with strange carvings, but without the institutional interest of museums or universities, no one imagined the hill was extraordinary. In a sense, the site was buried twice, once in the Neolithic, when its enclosures were deliberately filled with rubble, and again in the 20th century, when a cursory survey rendered it invisible to scholarship. This second burial lasted until the 1990s. By then, the Ataturk Dam project had flooded many valleys of the Euphrates, including 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, a site where unusual T-shaped pillars had first been documented. Klaus Schmidt, who had worked at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, was left looking for another place to continue his research. Guided by reports of carved stones and flints near the village of Urincik, he walked Göbekli Tepe in 1994. Unlike the surveyors before him, Schmidt noticed that the mound was steep and that fragments of finely worked limestone were scattered across its surface. For him, it was enough. Excavations began almost immediately, in cooperation with the Şanlıurfa Museum. The early seasons revealed what the surveyors of the 1960s had missed. Beneath just a metre or two of soil were massive stone pillars, carved into T-shapes and arranged in circular enclosures. The largest of these pillars weighed many tons and stood taller than any human. Their surfaces bore relief carvings of foxes, vultures, snakes, boars, and countless other animals. The pillars were not isolated finds. They formed part of carefully planned structures, their bases set into carved sockets in the bedrock, their alignments deliberate. What had looked like an ordinary mound was in fact an engineered hill, created layer upon layer as earlier enclosures were buried and new ones built on top. The realization was immediate and disorienting. These structures were not from the Bronze Age, not from the time of cities or kings. Radiocarbon samples placed them in the 10th millennium before present, more than 11,000 years ago. That date pushed monumental stone architecture back by several millennia into a period when archaeologists had assumed human groups were still small and mobile. Göbekli Tepe did not fit the script. From the first published reports in the late 1990s, the site began to attract global attention. Newspapers called it the world's first temple. Magazines framed it as the birthplace of organised religion. Documentaries lingered on the carvings and the eerie silhouettes of the T-shaped stones, often accompanied by swelling music and dramatic narration. For the public, the story was irresistible. Before cities, before farming, before writing, there was already a place where people carved gods and gathered to worship. The hill was no longer invisible. It had become a symbol. Yet the truth was far less tidy. Archaeologists working on the ground knew how limited the evidence was. The enclosures were impressive, but their purpose was not clear. The carvings were abundant, but their meanings were opaque. The site was massive, but it was also incomplete, with only a small fraction of the mound excavated. In science, uncertainty is normal, but uncertainty does not always sell, and so headlines leapt ahead of the data, declaring conclusions that researchers themselves had not yet reached. This tension between excavation and interpretation is what makes the early history of Göbekli Tepe in the modern era so revealing. On the one hand, it is the story of painstaking work. Teams of archaeologists cleared soil centimetre by centimetre, mapped stratigraphy, catalogued chipped stone tools and analysed animal bones. They debated whether the fill that buried the enclosures came from nearby quarries or from dismantled buildings. They compared the flint assemblages to those of other pre-Pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant. The process was slow, careful, and filled with unanswered questions. On the other hand, it is also the story of how media narratives form. The label First Temple spread quickly, repeated in article after article, even though no one could yet say with certainty what role the site played. The idea that belief had come before farming was repeated so often that it hardened into a kind of cultural shorthand, even as many archaeologists urged caution. Göbekli Tepe became a paradox, one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century, and also one of the most misunderstood. By the 2000s, the site had grown into an international project. Excavations expanded, protective shelters were built, and thousands of visitors began to arrive each year. UNESCO eventually listed Göbekli Tepe as a World Heritage Site, recognizing its extraordinary significance. Yet behind the growing fame was the memory of those first decades of neglect. It is humbling to realize that had Klaus Schmidt not looked twice in 1994, the mound might still be written off as a minor scatter of flint. History sometimes hinges not on the grand forces we imagine, but on small acts of persistence, a willingness to reconsider what others have dismissed. The story of Göbekli Tepe's rediscovery therefore reminds us that archaeology is shaped as much by its blind spots as by its findings. The mound was always there, its pillars buried and waiting. The animals were always carved, their shapes preserved in stone. But human attention was elsewhere. The prevailing models of prehistory did not allow for such a site to exist, so even when it was seen, it was not seen. Only when someone was prepared to question those models did the hill reveal itself. That lesson has implications beyond Göbekli Tepe. How many other sites have been passed over because they did not fit the expected pattern? How much of history remains invisible, not because it is lost, but because it does not conform to our ideas of what the past should look like? Archaeology is not simply about finding things, it is about recognizing them when we do. In the end, the long neglect of Göbekli Tepe is almost as instructive as its discovery. For 30 years it was a hill among many, ignored after a quick note in a survey. Then it became, almost overnight, a place that demanded we rethink the origins of human social life. Both truths are real. The mound was both invisible and overwhelming, both overlooked and world-changing. Which means the haunting question lingers. What else are we not seeing today? The story is still unfolding. Excavations continue, new pillars emerge each season, and new questions multiply. We cannot yet say what all of it means. What we can say is that a hill buried once in prehistory was buried again in our own time by the assumptions of archaeology. Only by questioning those assumptions did it come back into view. And so, the tale of Göbekli Tepe between the 1960s and the 2000s is not only about what lay beneath the soil, It is also about us, about the stories we tell, the blind spots we carry, and the humility we must keep when the past refuses to follow our expectations. What kind of world did the builders of Göbekli Tepe inhabit, and what did that land give them? To understand the stones, we first have to step back into the landscape that surrounded them, into the long millennia at the end of the Ice Age, when the great glaciers were retreating and the Near East was caught in a tug-of-war between cold and warmth. The people who eventually carved the animals into limestone were shaped by that world, and by the herds, rivers and wild plants that sustained them. Between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, the region we now call Upper Mesopotamia was perched on the edge of change. To the north, glaciers still lingered in the high mountains of Anatolia. To the south stretched the drier steppes and deserts of the Fertile Crescent. In between lay a mosaic of environments: rolling hills, grasslands, patches of oak and pistachio woodland, and river valleys fed by the Euphrates and Tigris. The climate was not stable. It oscillated between cooler, drier intervals and warmer, wetter pulses. For human groups, this meant opportunity but also constant uncertainty. Some years the land yielded abundant cereals and nuts. Other years droughts forced people to move further and forage wider. This was the twilight of the Pleistocene and the dawn of the Holocene. Herds of gazelle grazed the open steppe, moving in great numbers during seasonal migrations. Wild aurochs, massive ancestors of cattle, roamed the grasslands and river plains, powerful beasts weighing nearly a ton, difficult to hunt but providing enormous returns if brought down. Equally present were wild asses, onagers with speed and stamina, and herds of red deer and fallow deer in the more wooded zones. Smaller game filled out the diet: hares, tortoises, birds. In the skies vultures circled, crows cawed across the hills, and migratory waterfowl traced routes along the Euphrates. This was a living landscape, abundant yet unpredictable. The plant life was equally important. Wild stands of einkorn and emmer wheat grew in patches on the limestone ridges. Barley and rye appeared in mixed stands of grasses. People did not yet cultivate them in fields, but they harvested the seeds with flint sickle blades, carried them home, and ground them into flour. Nuts from pistachio trees and acorns from oak groves provided fat and carbohydrates. Almonds and figs grew in certain niches, adding variety. Lentils and peas were gathered from wild varieties. The land was not domesticated, but it was generous, and its seasonal cycles structured human movements. Archaeological evidence from sites across the region, such as Abu Huraira on the Euphrates and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 in southeastern Turkey, show how these communities lived. They built semi-permanent huts of mud and brush, clustered in small groups, moving when resources demanded. Grinding stones are found in abundance, suggesting that plant foods played a larger role than older stereotypes of hunters once allowed. The bones of gazelles dominate many assemblages, pointing to organised mass hunts during seasonal migrations. This was a world where cooperation was necessary, both to bring down large animals and to process the vast quantities of plant foods that sustained the group. By 13,000 years ago, this landscape was recovering from the Younger Dryas, a sharp return to colder, drier conditions that had disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. In the Levant, Natufian communities had already experimented with more settled life, building stone houses and harvesting wild cereals intensively. In Upper Mesopotamia, the response was similar but not identical. Here, groups adapted to local conditions, moving between steppe and woodland, between rivers and uplands, depending on what each season offered. The richness of the local environment, what scholars call the resource patchiness of the Fertile Crescent, meant that groups could stay longer in certain places, investing in structures and facilities for food processing. In this context, Göbekli Tepe makes more sense. The hill lay at a natural crossroads. To the west stretched the Harran Plain, to the east the rising Taurus foothills. Herds moved along these corridors. Wild cereals grew in abundance on the limestone ridges. Water from seasonal streams cut through the valleys nearby. It was a place where resources converged, and so did people. Groups who might otherwise have remained dispersed could gather here, drawn by the availability of food and the ease of hunting. But if the land gave abundantly, it also demanded flexibility. Herds could change their routes, drought could wipe out a year's grain, and sudden cold snaps could thin nut harvests. These fluctuations forced people to remain mobile, to maintain knowledge of wide territories, and to rely on cooperation across groups. The landscape itself trained them to live in networks, not in isolation. The animals that dominated their world were not just food, they were also competitors and symbols. To hunt an aurochs was to confront a creature of immense strength, a trial that required courage and coordination. To track gazelle herds meant knowing the land intimately, reading their paths, anticipating their movements. The people of Upper Mesopotamia lived in a constant dialogue with animals, one that was practical, but also likely spiritual in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. The carvings that would later appear on limestone pillars were not arbitrary decorations. They were rooted in daily encounters with creatures that fed, threatened, and inspired them. Flora, too, carried weight beyond sustenance. The repeated harvest of wild cereals required planning and foresight. If cut too early, the seeds would not ripen. Too late, and the wind would scatter them. Grinding stones were heavy investments, requiring labour to carve from basalt or limestone. Even without domestication, the reliance on plants was pushing groups toward new forms of organisation, with tasks divided among gatherers, processors, and hunters. Firewood gathering and the management of fuel for cooking added another layer of planning. The forest patches of oak and pistachio were not infinite. People had to move carefully to avoid exhausting them. Climate models suggest that rainfall in this period was higher than in the arid landscapes we see in southeastern Turkey today. The hills may have been greener, with more permanent streams. This made them attractive for settlement, but it also meant that as conditions fluctuated, groups needed to adjust. We can imagine years when gazelle herds were fat and plentiful, when pistachios bent their branches with nuts, when rivers teemed with fish, and we can imagine leaner years, when drought shriveled cereals and herds bypassed the area. Survival meant knowing more than one way to live off the land. Archaeozoological studies from sites of the period show butchery marks on gazelle and aurochs bones, evidence of organised hunts. Large quantities of small gazelle bones, often burned, suggest mass processing events, perhaps communal feasts or storage preparations. Charred seeds of wild barley and einkorn show that people roasted and ground grains into flour long before farming. The archaeological record preserves these traces like faint shadows, fragments of meals eaten thousands of years ago. It is worth remembering that none of this was inevitable. Humans had lived in the region for tens of thousands of years, hunting and gathering, adapting to changing climates. What made the period between 13 and 11,000 years ago distinctive was the combination of environmental richness and climatic fluctuation. Too poor a landscape, and people would have remained highly mobile, never building more than temporary shelters. Too stable a landscape, and there might have been less need for innovation. It was the balance of abundance and unpredictability that pushed communities to experiment with new forms of cooperation, new gathering places, and eventually monumental stone architecture. When we stand today at Göbekli Tepe, looking at the foxes and vultures carved into stone, we are looking at reflections of this landscape. These were not abstract symbols plucked from imagination. They were familiar creatures, seen daily, hunted, feared, and respected. The plants ground into flour on heavy stones were gathered in the same hills. The wood that fueled fires grew in nearby groves. The limestone itself was quarried from the bedrock beneath their feet. Göbekli Tepe was not a place apart from the world. It was built from the very fabric of the land that sustained its builders. And so when we ask what kind of world these people lived in, the answer is both simple and haunting. It was a world in flux, a world rich but demanding, a world where survival required cooperation and attentiveness. It was not paradise, nor was it hardship alone. It was a landscape alive with animals and plants, with shifting seasons, with opportunities and risks. What remains uncertain is how these conditions translated into the decision to build on such a monumental scale. Did abundance free people to invest labour in carving and construction? Did unpredictability push them to create shared places of gathering, to reaffirm bonds in times of stress? The evidence allows us to reconstruct the ecology, the diets, the materials, but the motivations remain hidden in silence. We can describe the gazelle hunts, the grinding stones, the nut harvests, We cannot yet know the thoughts that turned these experiences into carved vultures and towering stones. And so the question lingers. Was Göbekli Tepe possible only because of this landscape at this precise moment between Ice Age and Holocene? If the climate had shifted differently, if the hills had been less generous or more stable, would the stones ever have been raised at all? Could people settle before farming, and why did some groups already live in permanent houses? This question takes us to the Natufian culture of the Levant, a society that emerged around 15,000 years ago and persisted until roughly 11,000 years ago, just before the transformations of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic. Their world provides us with a rare glimpse of humans experimenting with settled life in the absence of agriculture. They did not yet plant fields or domesticate animals, but they built stone houses, buried their dead beneath their floors, and shaped tools that reflected a diet broad enough to include seeds, nuts, gazelle, fish, and birds. To understand the context into which Göbekli Tepe later appeared, we must first sit with the Natufians, because they represent one of the first known steps into a way of life that blurred the line between mobile foraging and sedentary village existence. The Natufians lived in the Levant, a region stretching from the Sinai in the south through the hills of Israel, Jordan and Lebanon, and up into the valleys of western Syria. This was a land of diverse microclimates. Coastal plains offered rich resources of shellfish and fish. Upland valleys provided stands of wild cereals, and wooded hills produced acorns, pistachios, and almonds. To the east, steppe landscapes supported gazelle herds. The region sat at the meeting point of Mediterranean rains and more arid continental climates, creating a patchwork of habitats that could be exploited by groups willing to adapt. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Ain Malahar in Galilee and Wadi Hamma in Jordan reveal how the Natufians lived. They built circular semi-subterranean houses with stone foundations. The floors were plastered or compacted earth, and hearths occupied central spaces. Unlike the ephemeral brush shelters of earlier hunter-gatherers, these houses were meant to last for seasons and even years. The clustering of multiple houses together created small hamlets, some of which may have been occupied by dozens of individuals at a time. For archaeologists, this was one of the first unmistakable signals of semi-permanent settlement. Yet farming had not arrived. Instead, the Natufians took what scholars call a broad-spectrum approach to subsistence. They harvested wild cereals like barley and wheat, cutting stalks with flint sickle blades. Grinding stones, mortars and pestles are found in large numbers at their sites, showing that processing plant foods was a daily task. They gathered nuts in season, particularly acorns and pistachios, which could be stored for leaner times. They hunted gazelle extensively, sometimes to the point of stressing local populations. Bones of deer, hare and waterfowl also appear in their middens. Coastal groups added shellfish and fish to their diet. What emerges is a picture of remarkable flexibility, where almost every available resource was taken advantage of. One of the striking features of Natufian life was the intensity of their stone tool industry. Microliths, tiny flint blades often set into wooden shafts, were common, and sickle blades show distinctive gloss from repeated cereal harvesting. This gloss is microscopic polish, caused by silica-rich plant stems rubbing against the stone. It tells us that even though the Natufians did not sow seeds, they were gathering enough wild cereals to leave behind a visible trace in their tools. That in itself suggests systematic harvesting at scales large enough to impact daily life. Another dimension of their culture was burial. At Ain Malahar and elsewhere, people were interred in or near their houses. Graves contained adults and children, often flexed on their sides. Some were adorned with personal ornaments such as shell beads, bone pendants, or even animal remains. A famous burial includes a man with a puppy, one of the earliest known indications of human-canid relationships, though whether this was a domesticated dog or a tamed wolf remains debated. Burials provide archaeologists with windows into social structure, showing that these communities invested in memory and ancestry, keeping their dead close to the living. The permanence of Natufian structures and burials raises the question, why settle at all without farming? The answer lies in ecology. The end of the Ice Age in the Levant was marked by warming and increased rainfall, leading to dense stands of wild cereals. In certain valleys, these resources were so abundant that groups could stay in one place for longer periods, harvesting, storing, and returning seasonally to known stands. Nuts and game supplemented this. Sedentism was possible where resource density was high, but it was not uniform across the region. Some groups remained mobile, others experimented with long-term settlements, and the balance shifted with climate fluctuations. The Natufians were not static. Around 12,900 years ago, the Younger Dryas brought colder, drier conditions back to the region. This sudden climate downturn stressed resources. Sites show evidence of increased mobility, smaller settlements, and greater reliance on small game. Yet the idea of building permanent houses and returning to favoured locations persisted. When the climate warmed again with the onset of the Holocene around 11,700 years ago, these precedents laid the groundwork for more permanent villages and eventually farming. Social life among the Natufians was complex. Evidence of communal activities comes from large grinding stones that may have been used by multiple families, and from the clustering of houses into hamlets that required some degree of coordination. Ornamentation points to symbolic life, with shells imported from the Mediterranean coast found inland, suggesting exchange networks. Personal adornments imply a sense of identity and social signalling. We do not know their myths or stories, but we can infer that they saw themselves as part of a web of relationships that extended beyond the household. What is humbling is how much we still do not know. Were the Natufians the direct ancestors of later farming cultures, or one of several parallel experiments in sedentary life? Were their houses occupied year-round or only seasonally? Did they plant seeds opportunistically, or only gather what grew wild? The evidence is fragmentary, and interpretations shift as new sites are excavated. Archaeology here is a puzzle with many missing pieces. What we can say is that the Natufians demonstrated that settlement was possible before farming. They built houses, stored food, buried their dead in formal ways, and created villages without domesticating plants or animals. This challenges older narratives that assumed agriculture must come first, followed by settlement. In reality, human history was less linear. People experimented. They tried out different ways of living. Sometimes these experiments lasted for centuries, sometimes they collapsed under climatic stress. But they left traces that show us the range of human possibility. The Natufians were neighbours, not in geography but in time, to the people who would later gather on the hills of Upper Mesopotamia. Their stone houses and grinding stones tell us that humans were already testing the boundaries of what it meant to live in one place, to create a sense of permanence, to anchor themselves to landscapes. They remind us that by the time the stones of Göbekli Tepe were raised, the idea of settlement was not new. What was new was the form it took in that particular place and moment. And so we are left with a question that echoes through time. If people could settle before farming, then what was it that truly pushed them to transform the land, to plant seeds and domesticate animals? Was sedentism itself the seed of agriculture, or was agriculture a separate invention that happened to fall on fertile ground? The Natufians lived at the threshold, showing us that human societies do not always follow straight lines from one stage to the next. They remind us that history is built not only from great leaps forward, but from experiments, some forgotten, some remembered in stone. How did hunter-gatherers stop moving without calling it farming? The story of early settlement is not one of a single leap from wild to domesticated, but of thousands of years of experimentation across the Fertile Crescent. Between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, people began to pause their migrations and spend longer periods in one place. They built houses that lasted more than a single season, dug storage pits, and left behind debris of intensive food processing, yet they had not domesticated wheat or barley, nor herded goats. What they did instead was stretch the logic of foraging to its limits, harvesting and storing in such abundance that mobility was no longer the only option. These were societies that blurred the line between camp and village, and it was in their shadow that the next stage of human life was set. The archaeological record across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia shows how flexible hunter-gatherers could be. One of the earliest and most evocative sites is Ahalo II, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in modern Israel. This site, dated to around 23,000 years ago, lies well before the window of the Natufians and the Pre-Pottery Neolithic. but it provides a crucial glimpse into the possibilities of semi-sedentary foragers. The huts of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 were brushwood structures with stone floors, burned and preserved in situ. Inside, archaeologists found grinding stones, hearths, and remains of more than 150 species of plants. The charred seeds included wild barley, wild wheat, and even grapes. The inhabitants were clearly gathering broadly from the environment, and the presence of grinding stone shows that cereals were already being processed for food. This was not farming, but it was a form of intensive plant exploitation that allowed longer-term stays in one location. By 13,000 years ago, in the terminal Pleistocene, such practices were spreading and intensifying. Sites like Abu Huraira in the Euphrates Valley of Syria illustrate the scale. Excavations there revealed a massive midden with remains of tens of thousands of plant species, along with gazelle bones by the thousands. The site was first occupied by mobile foragers around 13,000 years ago. They lived in pit dwellings, harvested wild incorn wheat and rye, and hunted gazelle in mass drives. Grinding stones at Abu Huraira are so numerous that archaeologists estimated many households were processing cereals daily. The abundance of seed impressions in plaster floors tells us that storage of gathered plants had become part of the household economy. Here we see the slow tilt of subsistence strategies towards settled life, even before domestication. Farther north, in the Tigris Valley of southeastern Turkey, lies 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, dated to about 12,000 years ago. This site is notable because it offers evidence for a permanent settlement of foragers without farming. The houses were circular, with stone foundations and interior hearths. Grinding stones and storage bins appear, but there is no evidence of domesticated cereals. Instead, the people of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 relied heavily on nuts, legumes and hunted animals, particularly pigs and sheep. Wild sheep bones show butchery marks, but not the age profiles typical of domestication. This was still hunting. What mattered here was not cultivation, but permanence. The community returned often enough or stayed long enough to build lasting stone structures. That distinction between temporary camp and durable house marks a shift in how people related to the land. These early villages remind us that farming was not a prerequisite for settlement. Instead, settlement created conditions that made farming attractive later on. Once people built houses, dug storage pits, and tethered themselves to specific places, the incentive to encourage plant growth nearby increased. A patch of wild cereals cut with flint sickles could be reseeded by accident, as dropped grains sprouted in disturbed soil. A stand of nut trees near a village could be tended and favoured. The boundaries between foraging and farming were porous, and for centuries or even millennia people may not have distinguished clearly between gathering and cultivating. Food processing left behind some of the most telling traces. Grinding stones, mortars and pestles littered the sites of Abu Huraira and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒. Residues show starch grains from barley and legumes ground into flour or porridge. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿2, microscopic analysis revealed seeds ground into pastes, perhaps cooked into flatbreads. These tools required investment in skill and effort. To grind cereals daily is laborious, but it provides calories that can support larger groups. It also produces foods that are storable, portable and digestible for children and the elderly. In other words, plant processing helped sustain larger communities for longer stretches. Storage was another crucial step. Archaeologists have found pits dug into floors or into the ground nearby, sometimes lined with stone or plaster. At Abu Huraira, seed impressions in mud plaster floors suggest that cereals were stored in bulk inside houses. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, large communal bins may have been used to store acorns or nuts. Storage meant that surpluses could be carried across seasons. It also meant that households had resources to defend. Once storage becomes part of life, mobility decreases. Abandoning a settlement means abandoning one's stored food, and that creates both an incentive to stay and new forms of social tension. The faunal record reveals parallel changes in hunting strategies. At Abu Huraira, gazelle remains dominate the earliest levels, often representing mass kills. Whole herds may have been driven into enclosures or ambushes, producing huge amounts of meat in a single event. Over time, as gazelle populations declined, hunting diversified into smaller game. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, evidence of repeated exploitation of pigs suggests that communities were testing the limits of sustainable hunting. While this was not domestication, it was intensive use of particular species in the orbit of permanent settlements. In a sense, animals too were being drawn into the gravity of villages, their movements tracked, and their populations stressed by repeated hunting. What emerges from these sites is a pattern. Hunter-gatherers across the Fertile Crescent began anchoring themselves to places where resources were rich. They built circular houses, invested in grinding stones, dug storage pits, and harvested intensively. These activities did not transform them into farmers overnight, but they created a framework in which the eventual step to domestication became logical. If one lives in a stone house and stores wild cereals, the leap to tending those cereals is smaller than if one is mobile. The path from camp to village was thus not a revolution, but a slow shift in priorities and practices. Why then did they stop moving? The reasons likely varied. Climate played a role. The end of the Pleistocene brought warming that allowed cereals and nuts to flourish in patches across the Levant and Mesopotamia. Certain valleys became particularly productive, making it feasible to stay put. Social factors mattered too. Larger groups may have preferred the stability of a fixed settlement, where relationships and memories could accumulate. Symbolic life also deepened. Burials beneath house floors tied families to specific locations, making mobility less attractive. Once a community buried its dead beneath the floor, the house was not just a shelter but a memorial. The transition from camp to village was not uniform, nor was it irreversible. During the Younger Dryas, some groups abandoned settlements as resources dwindled. But the precedent had been set. Humans had demonstrated to themselves that long-term residence was possible without farming. That idea lingered, ready to be expanded when conditions improved again. It is easy in hindsight to see these villages as inevitable steps toward agriculture, but the truth is that their inhabitants did not know what lay ahead. They were simply adjusting to the opportunities and challenges of their environments. They were not on a mission to invent farming or to create civilization. They were trying to survive, to feed their families, to find security in unpredictable climates. Archaeology lets us see the outcomes, but the intentions were likely much more modest. And yet, from our vantage point, it is clear how profound these experiments were. The people of Ohalo II, Abu Huraira, and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 were inventing new relationships with land and time. They tethered themselves to places, built durable homes, processed plants intensively, and stored food for future months. They turned camps into villages without calling it farming. The haunting question is, how many times in human history did such experiments happen, only to vanish without leaving traces we can still see? Are there hills still hiding forgotten villages beneath their soil, the evidence of other paths not taken? For now, what we can say with humility is that the story of settlement before farming is not linear, not simple, and not fully understood. But it is a reminder that human ingenuity is old, older than agriculture, older than cities. The first villages arose not with ploughs, but with persistence, patience, and the courage to stay. Why were people carving stone houses and benches before they built farms? This is one of the paradoxes of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, the period that stretched roughly from 10,000 to 9,000 years ago, across the Fertile Crescent. For a long time, archaeologists assumed that durable stone architecture was a product of farming, that people would only invest in heavy construction once fields tied them permanently to the land. Yet the evidence of early Neolithic sites tells another story. Long before true agriculture was stabilised, people were already digging into the earth, building semi-subterranean houses, setting stones into circular foundations, and fashioning communal buildings with benches and platforms. In short, they were building stone before cities, before ploughs, even before the first granaries filled with domesticated cereals. It forces us to ask what motivated these groups to invest in architecture when they were still living on wild resources. One of the keys to understanding this paradox lies in the shape and setting of the houses themselves. At sites across Syria, Turkey and the Levant, archaeologists have uncovered small circular or oval houses dug partly into the ground. These semi-subterranean dwellings often had walls of stone, sometimes supplemented with mud plaster, and roofs of timber and brush. The floors were frequently plastered smooth, occasionally with lime that had been heated to create a form of early cement. entry was not always at ground level. In many cases, ladders were required to descend through roof openings, a design that had practical benefits. Roof entry kept animals out, offered protection against intruders, and helped regulate indoor temperatures. Living partly beneath the ground also made it easier to maintain warmth in winter and coolness in summer. This was architecture born of adaptation rather than monumental ambition, but it was nonetheless a remarkable investment of energy and planning. Jericho, perhaps the most famous of these early Neolithic sites, illustrates the extent of these architectural experiments. By around 9,600 years ago, the community at Jericho had built not only houses, but also a stone wall several meters high and a round stone tower. The purpose of the wall has been debated, with interpretations ranging from defense to flood control. What matters is that a group of still predominantly foraging people invested in a large communal project that required quarrying, transporting, and fitting stones. The tower itself, with an internal staircase spiralling upward, remains one of the oldest known examples of such construction. Its presence in a village that was not yet fully agricultural challenges the neat categories we might want to impose between forager and farmer, temporary camp and permanent town. Other sites show less spectacular but equally telling evidence of early stone architecture. At Muribit on the Euphrates, small circular buildings with stone foundations formed clusters, each likely housing a family or extended group. Communal structures appear in the form of larger buildings with benches set along the walls, perhaps designed for gatherings, feasts, or rituals that brought the community together. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, also on the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered buildings with interior stone platforms and carefully plastered floors, including some with storage bins incorporated into the design. These features suggest that even before the reliable cultivation of cereals, people were investing in places to gather, store, and sit together. The effort required to shape benches out of stone indicates a desire for permanence and shared use beyond the daily needs of cooking and sleeping. One of the most striking aspects of these early Neolithic villages is the persistence of circular architecture. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherers had built circular huts from wood and brush. The choice to continue building in round forms, but now with stone and plaster, reflects continuity with the past even as materials changed. Roundhouses are efficient in terms of wall length relative to enclosed area, and they encourage a communal style of interior life, with shared hearths at the centre. The shift came not in shape but in substance. Where once brushwood sufficed, now stone was laid, plaster was poured, and heavy grinding stones were embedded in floors. These were not temporary shelters. They were anchored places in landscapes where people had decided, at least for a season or more, to stay. The construction of communal buildings in this period is particularly intriguing. Archaeologists have debated whether they represent early temples, council houses, or simply larger family residences. What is clear is that they stood apart in size and design from ordinary homes. Benches along walls, sometimes running the full length of a structure, suggest they were meant to seat groups of people for collective activities. The effort to build such spaces implies both social organisation and shared labour. They embody a kind of architectural prelude to the more famous monumental enclosures that would come later. Before pillars were raised, there were benches. Before carved animals adorned walls, there were plastered platforms on which people gathered. Building in stone also required new skills and coordination. Stones had to be quarried or gathered, shaped and placed. Mud plaster required careful preparation and repeated application. Roof beams, likely from scarce timber sources, had to be felled, transported and fitted. These tasks could not have been accomplished by individuals alone. They point to collaborative work at the scale of the village, work that reinforced social bonds and identities. In building together, people were not only sheltering themselves but also creating a shared world of durable forms. This raises the question of why such investment was made before farming took hold. One possibility is that architecture served as an anchor in times of change. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene brought shifting climates, fluctuating resources, and new challenges. In such uncertain times, building in stone might have been a way of creating stability, of rooting a community to place even as resources required flexibility. Another possibility is that architecture itself was a form of social negotiation. As groups grew larger and more complex, As storage and surplus created new dynamics, buildings offered ways to mediate relationships. A communal building with benches could provide a neutral space for discussion, decision-making, or ritual. The early use of lime plaster in floors and walls is another remarkable innovation of this era. Creating lime plaster required heating limestone to high temperatures, a process that demanded fuel and technical knowledge. The result was a smooth, durable surface that could be repaired and reused. Plastered floors discovered at Jericho and elsewhere show repeated resurfacing, suggesting long-term use and maintenance. The decision to invest in such technology reflects not only practical concerns, but also an aesthetic or symbolic desire for permanence and cleanliness. Walking on a plaster floor was different from walking on bare earth. It signalled a new relationship between humans and their built environment. It is worth pausing to consider what it meant to enter a house by ladder through the roof. This unusual feature appears at several pre-pottery Neolithic sites. It meant that the roof itself was a social space, perhaps used for daily activities, drying food, or simply moving between dwellings in close quarters. Descending into a semi-subterranean room would have been a sensory experience, a sudden change of light, a shift in temperature, the feeling of enclosure. These houses were not simply shelters, they shaped the rhythms of life, marking transitions between outside and inside, communal and private. In this way, the earlier stone architecture reveals itself as more than pragmatic. It created new experiences, new kinds of spaces, and new opportunities for social life. While we cannot know the full range of meanings these buildings held, we can see that they mattered enough for people to invest extraordinary effort into their construction long before agriculture made permanence inevitable. The haunting question is why some communities chose this path while others did not. Across the same regions, some groups remained mobile, building only temporary shelters and moving with the seasons. Why did the people of Jericho build a tower, while others nearby did not? Why did the villagers of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 carve benches into their walls, while other settlements left no trace of such communal architecture? The answers may lie in local ecologies, in cultural traditions, or in choices we can no longer reconstruct. But the diversity of responses reminds us that the path towards cities was not linear. It was a patchwork of experiments, some of which vanished without successes, others of which laid foundations for millennia to come. What we know, as far as evidence allows, is that stone came before cities. Architecture arose not from farming, but from a desire for place, stability, and shared life. The villages of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic remind us that people were building worlds together long before they built fields. They carved stone benches, plastered floors, and towers that still stand in the desert sun, as if to say that even without crops, even without cities, humans already had the impulse to build. How do you move a stone pillar weighing tons when you do not have wheels, draft animals, or metal tools? This is one of the most basic and still most haunting questions raised by Göbekli Tepe. Between roughly 9,600 and 9,000 years ago, people of Upper Mesopotamia quarried, shaped, transported, and erected limestone pillars that in some cases weighed as much as an elephant. These pillars were not scattered randomly but carefully positioned within circular or oval enclosures, each standing upright in sockets carved into the bedrock itself. They are the defining feature of the site, and they reveal a kind of engineering that seems far ahead of what most archaeologists would have expected of small-scale foraging communities. The story of these pillars is less about mystery and more about ingenuity. We may not know every detail of how they were raised, but the traces left in quarries and unfinished stones give us enough to piece together the labour and decisions behind them. The quarries themselves form the starting point. The bedrock of Göbekli Tepe is a soft but durable limestone, relatively easy to shape with stone hammers and chisels, but firm enough to support upright monoliths for thousands of years. Archaeologists have identified multiple quarrying areas around the mound, including half-finished pillars that were abandoned mid-process. These unfinished stones are priceless because they freeze in time the methods that otherwise would be invisible once a pillar was finished and moved. They show that the Neolithic builders cut trenches around the outline of a desired block, separating it from the bedrock by laboriously chipping away the stone. Large limestone hammers, often weighing several kilograms, were the primary tools. The process was slow, noisy, and exhausting, but with persistence, entire blocks several meters long could be isolated. Once a block was freed, the challenge shifted from carving to moving. This is where the ingenuity of these communities becomes most apparent. Without wheels, sledges and rollers made from wood are the most plausible methods. Experimental archaeology has shown that even very large stones can be moved with surprisingly small groups if logs are laid as rollers beneath them and constantly repositioned. Another possibility is dragging the blocks on sledges lubricated with water, clay, or even animal fat. The gentle slope of the mound at Göbekli Tepe may have been an advantage, allowing gravity to assist in some movements. Still, the distances were not trivial. Some quarries were only a short distance away, but others lay hundreds of meters from the final enclosures. Each movement required coordination, rhythm, and perhaps songs or chants to keep labourers working together. The sockets in which the pillars stand tell us about the final stage of the process. Builders cut neat, often rectangular holes directly into the limestone bedrock to receive the base of each pillar. These sockets were slightly larger than the pillar's foot, allowing the stone to be lowered and wedged in. To raise such a pillar, the community would likely have used a combination of earthen ramps and ropes. By dragging the pillar upright along a sloped ramp and letting it drop into its prepared socket, they could achieve vertical placement. Backfilling soil and stone around the base would stabilize it. Once set, a pillar could stand for millennia, as many still do today. The largest of the Göbekli Tepe pillars reach heights of over 5 meters and weigh more than 10 tons. Others are smaller, perhaps 3 meters tall and weighing only a few tons. The variation suggests a spectrum of effort, from stones that could be raised by a relatively small team to megaliths that demanded dozens of workers. The labour required for the largest pieces has been estimated in the thousands of person-hours. This means not only technical skill but also social organisation. People had to be gathered, fed and coordinated, which implies either a strong system of cooperation or leadership capable of directing such projects. Comparisons with earlier traditions highlight both continuity and innovation. Long before Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers had erected wooden posts for shelters and ritual structures. Timber post holes are found at many Epi-Paleolithic sites, and some communities constructed substantial timber frames. What happened at Göbekli Tepe can be seen as a translation of these timber forms into stone. The T-shape of the pillars echoes the form of upright posts with crossbeams. Instead of perishable wood, the builders now worked in enduring limestone. The act of quarrying and shaping stone was a leap in effort, but conceptually it may have drawn from familiar wooden prototypes. In other words, the pillars were not an inexplicable break, but a bold expansion of an older architectural vocabulary. One question that continues to puzzle archaeologists is why some pillars were left unfinished. In the quarries around the site, half-cut stones still cling to the bedrock, as if their makers walked away mid-task. Perhaps the stone fractured in the wrong way, making it unusable. Perhaps labour was interrupted by weather, conflict, or changing priorities. Or perhaps the process of quarrying itself carried meaning, and unfinished stones were not failures but simply part of a cycle of attempts. We cannot know for certain, but their presence reminds us that Neolithic construction was not a flawless industrial process. It was messy, contingent, and shaped by the limits of human strength and time. Transporting such stones also required innovation in rope technology. Plant fibres twisted into cords could achieve surprising strength, but moving multi-ton pillars would have demanded thick ropes and careful knots. The wear marks on some pillars suggest they were dragged in a horizontal position before being raised. Teams of people pulling in unison, perhaps guided by rhythm or chant, would have provided the force. Even if hundreds of people were involved, the coordination itself is evidence of social cohesion and shared purpose. The quarry scars visible today are a kind of negative monument, as revealing as the standing stones themselves. They show the effort invested in shaping the land, the repeated blows of hammerstones, the trenches cut deep into limestone. They are reminders that for every standing pillar admired today, there were countless hours of labour hidden from view. The landscape itself was reshaped, quarried, and transformed to produce the elements of the enclosures. The sheer act of raising a pillar, regardless of its meaning, must have been a dramatic event. Imagine the final moments, dozens of people hauling on ropes, the great stone slowly tipping upright, the sound of it grinding into its socket, then the heavy thud as it settled into place. Dust rising, shouts of relief. perhaps a communal meal afterward. These were occasions of labour, but also of spectacle. The memory of raising a pillar would have bound a community together, a story retold across generations. Even if the meaning of the pillar itself shifted over time, the act of raising it was already an accomplishment worth remembering. In the end, what the pillars show us is that human beings were capable of feats of engineering long before wheels, metal, or domesticated animals transformed technology. We should not underestimate the intelligence, planning, and collaboration of these early communities. They had only stone tools, but they also had ingenuity, persistence, and the ability to organize labour at significant scales. The pillars in the earth remind us that complexity does not require cities or kings. It can emerge from the collective determination of foragers who decided that certain stones should stand upright, perhaps forever. The unresolved question that lingers is why? Not why technically, but why socially? Why did communities who could have lived without stone monuments choose to spend their time and energy quarrying, dragging, and raising them? Was it competition between groups, cooperation within them, or simply the continuation of architectural traditions in new materials? We cannot answer fully, but we know enough to say that the pillars were not accidents. They were deliberate acts, shaped by choices and values we can glimpse but not wholly reconstruct. They still stand in the earth, mute but enduring, testaments to a moment when human beings decided that building in stone mattered more than convenience, more than efficiency, perhaps even more than survival itself. Why did people cover their stones with foxes, snakes, vultures, and boars? This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of Göbekli Tepe. The limestone pillars would have been impressive enough if they were left plain. Instead, they were turned into canvases, their surfaces carved with an astonishing range of animals. Between roughly 9,600 and 9,000 years ago, people of Upper Mesopotamia chose to adorn their megaliths not with abstract patterns alone, but with creatures that must have meant something to them. Foxes slink along the bases of pillars, snakes coil down their shafts, vultures stretch their wings, boars stand in profile, even scorpions, spiders, and wild asses make appearances. The sheer density of animals suggests that the builders were not simply decorating for decoration's sake. They were encoding meaning into stone, though exactly what that meaning was is still beyond our grasp. The first impression visitors have when looking at these carvings is the vitality of the animals. They are not stiff or formulaic. They move, creep, fly, and threaten. The artisans of Göbekli Tepe had an eye for anatomy, capturing the distinctive curve of a fox's back or the arch of a snake's body. Some creatures are shown in dangerous postures, teeth bared or stingers raised. Others appear more neutral, almost serene. The balance of danger and calm across the imagery makes clear that the builders were deeply familiar with these species, not as abstractions but as beings encountered daily in the surrounding landscape. Why choose these animals and not others? That is where the interpretations begin to multiply. Foxes, for instance, are among the most common carvings. Archaeologists have found dozens of fox images across the site, sometimes repeated in patterns. In the ecology of Upper Mesopotamia, foxes were frequent scavengers. They appeared around camp middens, stealing scraps. They were clever, elusive, and perhaps admired or feared for those qualities. At Göbekli Tepe, they may have symbolized cunning, or they may have been clan totems representing certain groups of people. We cannot be certain, but the repetition suggests significance. Snakes are another recurring theme. Carved in long parallel lines, they seem to slither down pillars, often in groups. The sheer number of serpents depicted suggests more than casual interest. In many later traditions, snakes symbolize danger, death, or renewal, but we should be cautious in projecting backward. What we can say is that snakes were plentiful in the region and would have been encountered regularly. Their presence on the pillars may indicate respect for their power, a kind of carved warning, or an association with underworld forces. Vultures too stand out. Some carvings show vultures with wings outstretched, sometimes near headless human figures. In the broader Near East, there is evidence that vultures were associated with excarnation rituals, where the dead were exposed to be defleshed by birds before their bones were buried. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 many centuries later, similar imagery appears in wall paintings. At Göbekli Tepe, the vultures may be linked to ideas of death and the journey of the soul. Yet again, we must be careful. We do not know whether the same meanings applied at this earlier stage, only that the repeated presence of vultures signals importance. Boars and aurochs also make appearances. Both were formidable animals in the landscape, providing meat when hunted, but also representing real danger. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, were enormous and aggressive. To carve them into stone may have been a way of taming their power symbolically, of fixing in place creatures too dangerous to control in life. Boars likewise were fierce quarry. Their presence on the stones may reflect both admiration and fear. What is striking is the scarcity of certain animals. Domesticated creatures are entirely absent. There are no sheep, goats, or cattle in the carvings. This suggests that at the time of Göbekli Tepe's construction, herding had not yet been adopted in this region. Instead, the imagery draws entirely from the wild world. This makes sense, as these were communities of hunter-gatherers. But it also suggests that the carvings reflect the mental and spiritual universe of people still embedded in wild ecologies. The animals they carved were the animals they depended on, feared, and shared the land with. The style of carving also tells us something about the level of skill. Most images are in low relief, meaning the background was cut away so that the animal stands out slightly from the surface. This technique requires planning and precision. Some carvings are deeply incised, creating bold outlines, while others are more delicate. The variation in style suggests multiple carvers, perhaps with different levels of training. Yet the overall consistency points to shared conventions, a tradition of how animals should be represented. One fascinating detail is that some pillars combine multiple species in dense compositions. Snakes intertwine with birds, foxes run beneath wild boars, insects crawl among larger animals. These combinations may represent scenes or symbolic juxtapositions. Were they meant to tell stories, or were they catalogues of the animal world? Without written records, we can only speculate, but the compositions are too deliberate to be accidental. They suggest that meaning emerged not only from individual animals, but from their relationships. The absence of humans in most carvings is another puzzle. With rare exceptions, the imagery at Göbekli Tepe is dominated by animals, not people. When humans do appear, they are often abstract, headless, or schematic. This imbalance hints at a worldview in which animals carried more symbolic weight than humans, or at least where animals were the chosen medium for expressing ideas. In a way, the pillars become mirrors of a world where human life was inseparable from animal life, and where meaning was projected onto the creatures that surrounded people daily. The animal imagery also invites us to think about memory and communication. In societies without writing, carving images into stone may have served as a way of preserving knowledge across generations. The animals could have acted as reminders of hunting grounds, seasonal cycles, or spiritual lessons. Each carving may have anchored a story told orally, a kind of mnemonic device that required the spoken word to bring it to life. If so, the pillars were not static art but prompts for storytelling, song, and ritual performance. It is tempting to read the carvings as proto-writing, a symbolic system on the edge of becoming script. While some researchers have suggested this, we must resist oversimplification. The images are powerful, but there is no evidence of a formalized writing system. Instead, they may represent a middle ground, more than decoration but less than text, a visual language whose grammar is lost to us. What we can say is that the carvings transformed the pillars into more than architectural supports. They became active surfaces, filled with meaning, where animals could be made present in stone. Visitors entering the enclosures would have been surrounded not just by the looming forms of the pillars, but by the eyes of foxes, the coils of snakes, the wings of vultures. The effect must have been immersive, a deliberate environment of stone and animal that shaped how people felt and thought. The resolution of this question, why these animals, why in this way, remains elusive. Perhaps each species carried multiple meanings depending on context. Perhaps they shifted over time as generations reinterpreted them. What we do know is that the carvings were central to the experience of the site. They were not afterthoughts, but integral parts of the architecture. Without them, the pillars would be silent. With them, they speak, even if we can no longer fully understand their language. The haunting question that remains is whether we ever will. Can we, separated by 10,000 years, truly know what a fox meant to the people of Göbekli Tepe? Or are we forever outsiders, seeing only the surface of symbols that once pulsed with meaning? The animals speak, but not in words we can translate. They speak in stone, in silence, and in mystery. Why are there no doors in the buildings of Göbekli Tepe? It is one of those questions that at first sounds like a riddle, a puzzle we might ask children. Yet when we look closely at the architecture, the absence of entrances is a glaring feature. Across the stone circles and rectangular rooms unearthed on the hill, archaeologists have noted that the walls are continuous, smooth, and unbroken by openings. Where we might expect a door or even a narrow passage, there is nothing. This absence immediately raises questions about how people moved in and out of these structures and what such architectural choices tell us about life at the site nearly 12,000 years ago. The simplest explanation, and the one most consistent with what we know of early pre-pottery Neolithic architecture elsewhere, is that the entrances were from above. The houses and special buildings of this period were often entered through the roof rather than through side doors. Ladders or notched wooden posts provided access down into semi-subterranean rooms, and once inside, inhabitants could sit, work, or gather in spaces protected from the wind and weather. This method of entry is well documented at other sites in the region, such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒. At Göbekli Tepe, it seems the same principle applied. When we imagine this, the architecture changes in our mind's eye. Instead of seeing the buildings as roofless circles or open courtyards, we should picture them covered with domes of timber, reeds, or hides, with smoke holes above and ladder access through carefully framed openings. The walls of limestone would have supported these roofs, perhaps in combination with wooden beams. What we see today are the bare stone shells, stripped of their organic components by time. It is easy to forget that thousands of years ago these buildings were complete and functional. Inside the rooms and enclosures, archaeologists have found features that speak to daily use. Benches line the inner walls of some circular structures, carved from stone and built to last. These benches could seat groups of people, suggesting communal gatherings. Hearths appear in several contexts, the remains of fires that once provided warmth and cooking facilities. Limestone basins have been discovered too, large, heavy vessels set into the floor. Their purpose is still debated, but they may have been used for storing water or processing food. Taken together, these features suggest spaces designed for more than momentary ritual. They were settings for repeated structured activity. One striking example is a rectangular room with a carefully plastered floor, a hearth at its centre, and a limestone basin set against the wall. The construction required planning and care, with stone slabs forming the floor and a neat arrangement of features inside. If this were a purely ceremonial building, why include such domestic details? Yet if it were only a house, why the monumental effort of carving and fitting stone so precisely? The ambiguity is what makes Göbekli Tepe so compelling. These were not simple huts, nor were they grand temples in the sense we know from later Mesopotamia. They were something in between, hybrid structures where daily life and communal performance overlapped. The benches themselves are fascinating. In a world before chairs, benches provided a way of seating multiple people in a shared arrangement. Those who sat on them would have faced inward toward the centre of the room, where fires or other activities took place. Such orientation suggests intentional design for group experience. The act of sitting together on stone benches, within enclosed walls, must have reinforced community bonds, hierarchy or cooperation. Some benches are higher or more elaborate than others, possibly indicating distinctions in who sat where. The absence of doors also adds a symbolic layer. Entering from above changes the way people experience these rooms. To descend a ladder into a closed space is different from walking through a threshold. It is more dramatic, more controlled. Those inside could regulate who came in and when. Roof entry creates a sense of enclosure, even secrecy. Combined with the benches and hearths, this suggests that the spaces were designed not just for practical shelter, but for orchestrated gatherings where entry and participation were carefully managed. Another feature that deepens the puzzle is the presence of carefully fitted stone walls. Unlike the crude piled stones of temporary shelters, the walls at Göbekli Tepe were built with care, their faces smoothed and aligned. This was construction meant to endure. The effort of quarrying limestone blocks, transporting them to the site, and arranging them into curving walls shows both technical skill and organisational capacity. These were not casual constructions, but deliberate investments of labour. What is curious is that many of the rooms were relatively small in floor area, sometimes only a few metres across. The scale suggests intimacy rather than vast crowds. This tension, monumental in effort but modest in size, is part of the enigma of the site. The limestone basins are perhaps the most mysterious elements. Some are large, heavy blocks hollowed out to form deep containers. Their weight suggests they were meant to remain fixed in place. They may have held water carried from nearby springs, or they may have been used to soak grains, process plants, or even prepare materials like lime plaster. Another possibility is that they served in communal feasting, holding food or drink consumed in group events. Whatever their purpose, their permanence contrasts with the more portable vessels made of clay or organic material that would later appear in the Neolithic. At GÖBEKLI TEPE, storage was literally carved into the architecture. Hearths, too, reveal continuity with other Neolithic sites. Fire was central to daily life, and the remains of ash and charcoal provide valuable clues for archaeologists. By analysing burnt plant remains, we can reconstruct what people were cooking, which in turn tells us about their diets. At GÖBEKLI TEPE, hearths contain traces of wild cereals, legumes, and animal bones. These were not empty, sterile spaces. They were filled with the smoke of fires, the smell of roasting meat, and the chatter of people gathered inside. The absence of doors has one further implication: privacy. With roof entrances once inside, the walls cut off the outside world completely. Conversations, rituals, or meals would have been hidden from those not admitted. This architecture created boundaries, both physical and social. In small-scale societies, such boundaries matter. They shape who is included and who is excluded, who has access to knowledge and who does not. The missing doors are thus not just a quirk of design, but a sign of controlled participation. Of course, we must be cautious. What we see today is incomplete. Stone survives, but wood, reeds, hides, and other organic materials do not. There may have been partitions, roofing structures, or movable furniture that have vanished entirely. We reconstruct based on the negative space left behind, like trying to imagine a house from its foundations alone. Archaeologists remind us again and again that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Still, what we do have points consistently toward an architectural tradition where roof entry was the norm and where interior spaces were carefully curated environments for human interaction. When we place Göbekli Tepe in the wider context of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, the similarities are striking. Across the Fertile Crescent, communities were building semi-subterranean structures with plastered floors, stone benches, and roof access. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 on the Euphrates, for instance, has yielded circular communal buildings with features that echo what we see in southeastern Turkey. The same is true at Muribit, farther downstream, and at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 not far from Göbekli Tepe itself. These sites show that people across the region were experimenting with durable architecture, embedding themselves in fixed places even before the full transition to farming. Göbekli Tepe was extraordinary in scale, but it was not isolated from these broader traditions. So why the missing roofs? Why the missing doors? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we can say is that these choices shaped how people interacted with the spaces, entering from above, sitting on stone benches, gathering around hearths, using heavy basins, and experiencing enclosure in a way new to human history. These were not caves or open campsites, but deliberately enclosed stone rooms. They represent a mental shift as much as a technological one, a decision to reshape human gatherings with architecture rather than adapt architecture to gatherings. The haunting question is whether we should think of these as houses or as something else entirely. Were they homes in the sense we understand, or were they communal chambers for select activities? The absence of doors makes them feel less like family dwellings and more like shared spaces for groups, but the hearths and basins pull us back toward daily life. Perhaps they were both, their functions shifting over time, fluid as the communities who built them. The missing doors leave us with more than an architectural puzzle. They leave us with a metaphor for the limits of our knowledge. We can look at the walls, we can peer inside, but without the doors we are still outsiders, guessing at what it felt like to enter, to sit, and to belong. Matter more than the carved ones. It seems counterintuitive at first glance. Tourists and television specials fixate on the towering T-shaped pillars and their intricate animal carvings, as if these alone carried the story of Göbekli Tepe. But when archaeologists sift through the deposits layer by layer, what they find in greatest abundance are not statues, nor basins, nor monumental architecture. They find broken stone flakes, discarded cores, and snapped blades. Tens of thousands of them. Each one the remnant of a single strike of hammer on flint or obsidian. They are the byproducts of everyday life, and they reveal more about the rhythms of the site than the grand sculptures ever could. Knapping, the process of reducing a raw stone into useful tools, was not glamorous. It left cuts on the hands and dust in the air, but without it, nothing else worked. To cut meat, scrape hides, harvest cereals, drill beads, or fashion wooden handles required sharp stone edges. At Göbekli Tepe, chipped stone artifacts account for the overwhelming majority of finds. In the earliest publications, they were treated as background noise compared to the massive enclosures. Yet in recent years, specialists have been showing us that these fragments are in fact the heartbeat of the site. They tell us what people did there day after day, far beyond any ceremonial gathering. The tools themselves fall into several categories. There are the cores, the chunks of flint or obsidian from which smaller blanks were struck. There are flakes, irregular pieces removed from cores by hard or soft hammer percussion. There are blades, long and narrow products struck with more precision. And there are tools made from these blanks, arrowheads, scrapers, perforators, burins, each retouched to create a specific edge or point. At Göbekli Tepe, these types appear in great numbers, and their distribution across the site reveals activity patterns. One of the surprising findings from the last decade is that lithics at Göbekli Tepe fit into the so-called West Wing tradition of Pre-Pottery Neolithic chipped stone industries. This means that the technology and typology of tools at the site are consistent with settlements across the upper Euphrates Valley, rather than being unique inventions. Arrowheads in particular provide clear chronological markers. Types such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 and 𝐓𝐿1 points show that the site was fully integrated into broader Neolithic technological traditions. This challenges earlier claims that Göbekli Tepe was a specialized cultic center, disconnected from everyday life. If the chipped stones look like those from settlements, then perhaps the site itself functioned like a settlement, or at least hosted similar activities. Consider the sheer volume. Excavations of even small areas yield thousands of lithic pieces. Cores were reduced on site, flakes discarded in clusters, blades carefully shaped and sometimes broken during use. Archaeologists have found concentrations that look very much like knapping workshops, where skilled individuals sat and produced tools for others. In some contexts, half-finished tools lie beside debitage, suggesting that production was interrupted or abandoned in place. Such assemblages are not the result of ritual deposition but of ordinary craft. What makes this especially important is that it reframes our interpretation of Göbekli Tepe. If people were knapping stone tools here, then they were also preparing hides, cutting plants, and hunting game in the immediate surroundings. This is not the behaviour of pilgrims visiting briefly for ceremonies and then leaving. It is the behaviour of communities spending extended periods at the site. It suggests cooking, clothing production, and domestic maintenance alongside whatever symbolic activities occurred in the monumental enclosures. In other words, chipped stone research brings balance to a narrative once dominated by talk of temples and cults. The technology itself reveals much about knowledge transmission. To produce a blade requires not only access to good raw material, but also learned skill. Striking at the wrong angle ruins a core. Too much force shatters the stone. Archaeologists studying bulbs of percussion and butt types can distinguish whether people used hard hammer stones, soft antler billets, or pressure flaking techniques. At Göbekli Tepe, evidence shows that knappers used a range of methods, adapting to the qualities of their material. Such diversity suggests a community of practice where skills were shared and passed down through teaching. Stoneflakes thus capture not just function but pedagogy, the learning of craft in an early village society. There lies in the raw materials themselves. Most of the chipped stones are flint, which occurs naturally in nodules across the limestone landscape of southeastern Turkey. Some, however, are obsidian, a volcanic glass not local to the region. Sourcing studies trace these pieces to Cappadocia and eastern Anatolia, hundreds of kilometres away. Their presence at Göbekli Tepe indicates exchange networks spanning vast distances. These networks were not likely built for ritual alone, but for the flow of materials essential to daily subsistence. Obsidian blades were prized for their sharpness, and their appearance here ties the community into a larger web of interaction across the Fertile Crescent. Wear analysis studies add yet another dimension. Under microscopes, the edges of tools show characteristic polish, striations and fractures depending on how they were used. Some were used to cut cereals, leaving glossy sickle sheen along their edges. Others scraped hides, leaving distinctive wear. Still others drilled or carved harder materials. The range of useware at Göbekli Tepe demonstrates a community engaged in a wide array of tasks, from plant harvesting to hide preparation. This again undermines the idea of a site reserved only for symbolic gathering. The stone tools show life, work, and survival. One often overlooked aspect is the taphonomy of these assemblages. Over thousands of years, natural processes mix deposits, creating challenges for archaeologists. Sometimes artifacts from different periods ended up together, obscuring chronological patterns, but careful stratigraphic work and statistical analysis have begun to untangle this mixing. In rare cases where unmixed assemblages are found, the picture becomes clearer. These tools look just like those from contemporary settlements. The conclusion is unavoidable. Göbekli Tepe was not alien to daily Neolithic life, but embedded within it. The question remains, why then did early researchers hesitate to interpret the site as a place of residence? Part of the answer lies in the sheer monumentality of the enclosures. The towering pillars overshadowed the mundane debris of napping floors. Media coverage reinforced the idea of temples at the dawn of civilization, making the site seem wholly exceptional. Yet as more detailed studies of the lithics emerged, it became apparent that ignoring them meant ignoring the majority of the evidence. The broken stones, humble as they may appear, are the key to understanding how people actually lived there. Of course, we should acknowledge that not all chipped stones point to long-term habitation. Some may have been produced in preparation for feasts or gatherings, their functions tied to communal events. The distinction between domestic and ritual is not always clear, especially in early Neolithic contexts where categories were fluid. But what is certain is that napping was integral, not peripheral, to Göbekli Tepe. To interpret the site without accounting for the lithics is like writing a history of a city while ignoring its kitchens and workshops. The haunting question, then, is why we humans are so easily dazzled by the monumental and so quick to dismiss the mundane. A pillar with carvings makes headlines, while a bucket of flakes seems trivial. Yet the flakes tell us who knelt on the ground, who struck stone against stone, who passed down techniques across generations. They remind us that history is not just the story of visionaries carving foxes into limestone, but of ordinary people cutting, scraping, and preparing the necessities of life. The broken stones matter more precisely because they are broken. They are the fragments of living, of doing, of being. Without them, the pillars are only silent stone. With them, the site becomes human again. How do you feed hundreds of people without farms? It is a question that brings us to the quiet heart of Göbekli Tepe, to the tasks that left no towering stones, but shaped the daily survival of those who built them. Monumental pillars capture our attention, yet the site is equally defined by the shallow depressions, grinding slabs, and stone basins scattered across its layers. They tell of laborious, repetitive work, seeds gathered in baskets poured onto flat stones, pounded and ground until flour was produced. Long before cultivated wheat or barley dominated diets, communities here managed to extract sustenance from the wild with ingenuity and determination. Archaeologists catalogue hundreds of grinding implements at the site, some fixed in place and others portable. These range from simple handstones to large querns with smooth basins worn deep by years of use. Their abundance alone signals the scale of food preparation. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not sustained by fleeting snacks carried in from distant camps. They were grinding enough to feed groups gathered in significant numbers, and they were doing it continuously. Each shallow depression, each polished surface, is testimony to thousands of hours of effort. The context is critical. Between roughly 9,600 and 9,000 years ago, the communities of Upper Mesopotamia lived in a transitional ecology. Wild cereals such as corn and barley grew in abundance on the slopes of 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐒 and in patches of open land around the limestone hills. These grains were not domesticated yet, but they were accessible, and hunter-gatherers had been harvesting them since the late Pleistocene. At GÖBEKLI TEPE, grinding stones proved that these cereals were processed on site in large quantities. Combined with evidence from other settlements in the region, this suggests a broad-spectrum subsistence economy, where nuts, seeds, legumes and cereals all played roles alongside hunting. What makes GÖBEKLI TEPE distinctive is the concentration of heavy grinding equipment. Portable tools could have been used by small family groups, but the fixed installations imply communal processing. Some archaeologists argue that this points to feasting, gatherings where food was prepared at scale to support work on the enclosures or to mark social events. Even without formal agriculture, wild stands of cereals could be harvested in bulk with flint sickle blades, stored temporarily, and ground when needed. The grinding stones on site make this scenario plausible. Rainwater management is another often overlooked part of the story. GÖBEKLI TEPE sits on a limestone ridge with no permanent spring or river immediately adjacent. To sustain groups at the site, people must have collected water. Archaeologists have documented carved depressions and channels that may have functioned as cisterns or catchments, allowing rainwater to be stored in bedrock cavities. These installations, though less dramatic than a pillar with a carved fox, are vital clues to how daily needs were met. Without such provisions, the site could not have hosted extended gatherings or construction efforts. Food storage too leaves its traces. Large stone vessels found at GÖBEKLI TEPE, some weighing hundreds of kilograms, suggest that liquids or bulk plant products were held on site. Their size and placement within enclosures indicate communal use rather than private hoarding. Traces of residues in some vessels have been interpreted as evidence of fermentation, hinting at the production of early beer-like drinks from cereals. If so, these basins may connect directly to the social gatherings that brought people together at GÖBEKLI TEPE. Drinking and feasting could have helped bind groups, turning subsistence into social glue. Still, it is worth pausing before drawing sweeping conclusions. We do not have written recipes, and the residues are open to multiple interpretations. What we can say with confidence is that grinding stones and storage basins demonstrate deliberate planning for food supply. People did not simply arrive at the site and improvise. They prepared by harvesting, transporting, and processing resources, ensuring that hundreds could be fed for days or weeks at a time. The scale of work involved should not be underestimated. To feed even a modest group of 100 people with grain-based meals requires grinding tens of kilograms of cereal each day. Each grinding session could take hours, demanding physical endurance and skill. Archaeologists studying wear patterns on handstones have shown how repetitive motion smoothed their surfaces, creating polished planes over decades of use. In some cases, multiple generations likely worked the same stones. Here, the monumentality lies not in height but in persistence, the slow grinding of seeds into flour across centuries. Comparisons with other sites of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic help contextualize these finds. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, just across the Syrian border, archaeologists uncovered similar grinding installations within communal structures, reinforcing the idea that large-scale food processing was central to gatherings. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, circular houses included querns and mortars, showing how plant foods were integrated into early sedentary life. GÖBEKLI TEPE fits into this broader pattern, but on a scale magnified by the size of its gatherings and the monumental nature of its architecture. There is also an ecological perspective to consider. Harvesting wild cereals is opportunistic. Some years' yields would have been abundant, in others sparse. The presence of grinding stones implies that people built flexibility into their subsistence strategies. When cereals were plentiful, they could be stored and processed for feasts. When less available, other plants such as lentils, pistachios, or almonds might have filled the gap. The grinding technology was adaptable, capable of turning almost any seed or nut into usable food. It reflects resilience in the face of environmental uncertainty. In the absence of domesticated animals or metal tools, the investment in stone grinding equipment was significant. Quarrying, shaping, and transporting large querns or basins required labour. Once in place, these tools became fixed assets of the community, anchoring food preparation to particular locations. Their very presence encouraged people to return repeatedly, reinforcing the role of the site as a hub. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this as a form of niche construction, where human behaviours modify the environment in ways that feed back into settlement patterns. At GÖBEKLI TEPE, grinding stones were part of the built environment that structured how people lived and gathered. One might ask, why invest such effort if farming had not yet begun? The answer lies in the transitional character of the time. People were not yet cultivating domesticated cereals, but they were already organising their lives around predictable resources. Wild stands of acorn and barley were reliable enough to support investment in grinding and storage. These practices paved the way for later domestication, but at the time they were simply pragmatic solutions to feeding groups at scale. The line between foraging and farming was blurry, and grinding stones occupied that ambiguous space. The haunting question is whether the people at GÖBEKLI TEPE realised the path they were setting in motion. Each handstone, each quern, each basin was a step toward a way of life more fixed, more labour-intensive, and more dependent on plant foods than that of their ancestors. Did they sense that the act of gathering for feasts and grinding thousands of seeds bound them not only socially but ecologically, tying them to the landscape in ways that would ultimately lead to permanent villages and true agriculture? Or was it, in their minds, simply the practical work of the moment, done to sustain the next gathering, the next construction, the next story told in stone? In either case, the grinding stones remind us that history is shaped as much by the quiet, repetitive motions of daily life as by the grand gestures of the monument building. The pillars could not stand without the calories released from countless seeds. The carvings of foxes and snakes had no audience without meals to sustain the people who gathered. Beneath the dust of the quarry and the weight of the pillars lies the true foundation of GÖBEKLI TEPE, the persistent sound of stone against stone, grinding 1,000 seeds into the flour of survival. Was GÖBEKLI TEPE built on an empty stomach, or as a feast that brought people together? This is the question that rises from the heaps of animal bones that lie, layer after layer, beneath the monumental enclosures. While the stone pillars attract attention, the real story of sustenance at this place comes from fragments of gazelle horn cores, splintered aurochs bones, cracked boar tusks, and thousands of tiny pieces that once carried the weight of flesh. Archaeozoology, the careful study of animal remains, gives us one of the clearest windows into the lives of those who built and used GÖBEKLI TEPE. Each fragment of bone speaks of meals consumed, animals hunted, and the scale at which communities gathered. Excavations across the main enclosures and adjacent layers have revealed faunal assemblages numbering in the tens of thousands. When studied systematically, certain patterns emerge. The overwhelming dominance of wild game, particularly gazelle, is striking. In some layers, up to 80% of identifiable bones belong to gazelle, suggesting that mass hunting events supplied meat for the site. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, appear less frequently but are represented by large and robust bones that would have carried enormous quantities of meat and fat. Wild boar also feature in the assemblage, their bones distinctive not only for their size but for the clear evidence of butchering. Smaller game such as hare, deer and birds are present, but play a minor role compared to the large herds that roam the plains. The pattern is not what one would expect from a small household site. Instead, the distribution of bones and the presence of cut marks, burning and breakage indicate large-scale processing. Long bones were split open to extract marrow, an energy-rich food. Skulls were cracked for brains, another nutrient-dense source. Many bones were burned, suggesting cooking over open fires or disposal in hearths after feasting. The sheer density of refuse suggests not the casual meals of a few families, but repeated episodes where large groups consumed animals together. If we step back and consider the environment, this picture becomes more vivid. Between roughly 9,600 and 9,000 years ago, the uplands of southeastern Anatolia were home to migrating herds of gazelle. Seasonal drives could have brought thousands of animals through valleys near GÖBEKLI TEPE. Skilled hunters, working cooperatively, might have organised large-scale roundups, driving animals into enclosures or ambushes. Ethnographic parallels from more recent societies show that such hunts are possible without domesticated animals, relying instead on coordination, knowledge of the landscape and social cohesion. The reward would have been extraordinary amounts of meat, far more than a single group could consume in ordinary circumstances. Feast would have been the natural solution. The aurochs tell a slightly different story. These massive bovines, standing taller than modern cattle and weighing close to a metric ton, were formidable prey. Hunting them required courage, cooperation, and likely ritual preparation. To bring down an aurochs was both a practical achievement and a symbolic act. At GÖBEKLI TEPE, aurochs' bones appear often enough to suggest they were valued prey. Their horns and skulls may also have been used for display, and their sheer size meant that one kill could feed dozens of people. The combination of gazelle herds for quantity and aurochs for prestige fits the archaeological record well. Wild boar add another element. Their bones at GÖBEKLI TEPE are frequently associated with butchering marks, and the discovery of a remarkable carved boar statue in recent excavations underscores their significance. Boar would have been dangerous to hunt, yet their meat and fat were prized. The association of their imagery with the site's art hints that they carried meaning beyond subsistence, perhaps linked to identity or mythology. But the bones themselves tell the story of meals, of feasts where roasted boar might have been shared among groups. What do we make of this? The scale of faunal remains strongly supports the idea of large communal gatherings at GÖBEKLI TEPE. Whether for construction events, seasonal rituals, or social exchange, groups came together in numbers far exceeding ordinary domestic life. Feasting is a reasonable explanation for the archaeological pattern. It provides a framework for understanding how people could mobilize labour to quarry, carve, and raise the massive pillars. Food, particularly meat in large quantities, served as both sustenance and social reward. Yet we must be careful. Archaeologists debate whether the bones represent feasts in the sense of organised ritual meals, or simply repeated episodes of communal consumption. The line between the two may be blurry. What is clear is that the volume of refuse exceeds what we would expect from daily meals at a small settlement. Even if GÖBEKLI TEPE was inhabited, the surpluses of meat point to gatherings where food was central. Another question arises: how did people preserve or consume such quantities of meat without refrigeration? Some practices may have helped. Smoking or drying could extend the shelf life of meat, and cooking in large pits might have allowed for storage of stews or soups. But much of the evidence points to rapid consumption, to events where meat was eaten soon after the hunt. The bones, with cut marks and signs of burning, suggest that animals were butchered, roasted, and shared in the moment. In this sense, feasting was not only about calories, but about creating shared experiences. The distribution of bones within the site also matters. Archaeologists find concentrations of faunal remains in and around the monumental enclosures, not hidden away but integrated into the spaces where pillars rose. This suggests that the consumption of animals was part of the activities that animated these structures. Whether ritual, social, or practical, eating was inseparable from the use of the enclosures. The monuments and the meals belong to the same story. Evidence of tool use on the bones further enriches the picture. Cut marks show where tendons were sliced, where joints were separated, where meat was stripped from bone. Percussion marks reveal deliberate smashing to access marrow. These traces are unmistakable signatures of human activity. They confirm that the animals were not simply scavenged but hunted, butchered, and processed systematically. Some scholars propose that the scale of feasting at GÖBEKLI TEPE may have been one of the driving forces for social change. To organise such events required planning, cooperation, and perhaps hierarchy. Who coordinated the hunts? Who distributed the meat? Who decided when to feast and when to conserve? These questions touch on the social complexity of early Neolithic societies. The animal bones are silent, but they imply systems of decision-making beyond the level of a single family. From a nutritional standpoint, the reliance on gazelle, aurochs, and boar provided abundant protein and fat. Such diets could sustain the heavy labour of quarrying and carving stone. The feasts were not mere indulgence, they were fuel for monumental work. If one accepts that construction required dozens, if not hundreds, of coordinated workers, then the provision of food at scale was a logistical necessity. Feasting may have been as much about maintaining energy as about ritual expression. Of course, questions remain. Were the feasts seasonal, tied to migrations of gazelle? Did they coincide with specific construction phases? Were they open to all, or restricted to certain groups? Archaeology cannot answer these with certainty, but the bones at least show that animals were consumed in extraordinary numbers. They tell us that meat, the most valued of foods in many hunter-gatherer societies, was abundant here, even in the absence of domestication. This brings us back to the opening question. Was Göbekli Tepe built on an empty stomach, or through the surpluses of feasting? The evidence leans strongly toward the latter. Hunters brought in gazelle by the dozens, slaughtered aurochs, carved boar, and shared their spoils around fires and within enclosures. The work of raising pillars was fueled by roasted meat, marrow-rich bones, and the social bonds forged in communal meals. And yet, one cannot ignore the haunting possibility that the feasts were not always enough. Hunting is unpredictable. Some years herds would have been smaller, prey harder to find. Did gatherings sometimes strain against scarcity? Were there times when feast fell short, when expectations outpaced supply? The bones do not tell us of disappointment, but the question lingers. Feasts bind people together, but famine reminds them of fragility. In that tension, the builders of Göbekli Tepe lived, celebrated and endured. Why carve channels into the rock when you have no wells? That question has hovered over the edges of Göbekli Tepe since archaeologists began to notice not only the monumental stone pillars and carved animals, but the subtler marks cut into the limestone bedrock itself. For all the focus on feasting, hunting and quarrying, one truth is inescapable. People cannot gather in such numbers without reliable water. Yet the limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia is not a place where streams and rivers flow in abundance. The hilltop of Göbekli Tepe has no natural springs, and wells would not be feasible given the hardness and depth of the bedrock. What the builders left behind instead were carved gutters, basins and pits, a quiet infrastructure for harvesting rainwater. Excavations have revealed channels incised directly into the limestone surface, running across the plateau in controlled paths. These grooves, often just a few centimetres wide but extending for metres, were clearly not natural fissures. They were deliberately made to catch and direct the flow of rainfall. At points, these channels feed into depressions or carved pits that could act as reservoirs. Some of these basins are several metres across and up to 3 metres deep, suggesting they could store significant quantities of water. At first glance, they might look like quarries or accidental depressions, but their placement and integration with the channels strongly supports intentional water collection. This system of rainwater harvesting fits the environmental reality of the early Holocene. Around 9,600 to 9,000 years ago, southeastern Anatolia was greener and more humid than today, with oak and pistachio woodlands scattered across the landscape. But the limestone plateau where Göbekli Tepe sits would still have been seasonally dry. Rainfall was concentrated in certain months, and summer would have brought drought-like conditions. To sustain large gatherings, people needed to capture water when it fell and hold on to it through the dry season. Rainwater harvesting rather than deep wells was the solution. The presence of limestone basins within and around the enclosures reinforces this picture. Some of these are portable-sized vessels, carefully hollowed out of stone, while others are larger features carved directly into the ground. Their function is not always clear, storage, mixing, ritual, but in combination with the channels, a utilitarian explanation makes sense. Archaeologists have noted that the stone vessels could have served for storing liquids, perhaps even grain, but water storage is among the most likely uses, given the absence of natural sources on the hill. One of the largest known storage pits on the site, measuring 8 metres in diameter and 3 metres deep, lies on the northwestern edge of the mound. Its capacity would have been immense, enough to support not only daily needs, but also the surges of demand when groups assembled for construction or communal events. The very effort to carve such a pit suggests forethought, cooperation, and an investment in permanence. A people who were supposedly only hunters and gatherers were already engineering water systems of a kind we might expect in small farming villages. When archaeologists trace the channels across the site, they find evidence that slabs once covered them, keeping water clean and preventing evaporation. This indicates knowledge not only of how to capture water, but how to preserve it for later use. Rainfall collected on the plateau's surface could be guided into protected conduits and stored in reservoirs, accessible when needed. In a semi-arid environment, such technologies are not luxuries but necessities. Without them, gatherings on the barren hilltop would have been unsustainable. It is tempting to imagine a dry season at Göbekli Tepe, the enclosures filled with people, fires burning, animals being butchered, and at the same time someone lifting slabs to access stored rainwater. The carved basins would not have seemed dramatic, but they were the infrastructure that made everything else possible. Stone monuments and feasts could only exist if thirst was quenched. In this sense, the humblest channels in the bedrock are as important to understanding the site as the tallest pillars. Archaeologists sometimes caution against projecting too much modern logic onto prehistoric systems. Could these basins have had symbolic or ritual functions? Perhaps. Water itself often carries symbolic weight in human cultures. It sustains life, and in many traditions it serves as a medium between worlds. At Göbekli Tepe, water may have been both practical and symbolic, with basins used not only to drink, but also to wash, to mix, or to perform rituals of purification. The dual role of function and meaning is common in human history, but even if water held symbolic importance, the physical need for storage would have been undeniable. There is also the matter of scale. A single family might survive by carrying skins of water up the hill from nearby springs or streams, but the volume of bones, grinding stones, and refuse at Göbekli Tepe suggests gatherings far larger than a household. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of people would have required constant supplies of water, not just for drinking but for processing food, cleaning, and perhaps for making plaster or mortar. The rainwater channels and basins seem tailored to that scale of demand. Some researchers have suggested that this infrastructure reflects increasing sedentism, an early step toward village life. The effort to engineer water systems implies people were not merely passing through but intended to stay for extended periods. Yet Göbekli Tepe does not neatly fit the definition of a village. It was neither a cluster of domestic houses nor a simple campsite. Instead, it seems to occupy an in-between space, part settlement, part gathering place, part monument. The water systems highlight that complexity. Comparisons with other contemporary sites help contextualize the evidence. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, another pre-Pottery Neolithic site in southeastern Anatolia, similar stone channels and basins appear, though on a smaller scale. At Çayönü to the east, archaeologists found sophisticated systems for drainage and water management in later levels. Göbekli Tepe is not unique in developing water technologies, but it is striking for how early and large-scale the efforts appear. The people here were not improvising. They were planning, carving, and coordinating at levels that belie their reputation as mere hunters. When one looks closely at the carved channels, their precision stands out. They are not random grooves but carefully cut with stone tools, straight or gently curving, designed to lead water efficiently downslope. Their survival after more than 9,000 years is testament to the effort invested. That effort raises questions. Who decided where to cut the channels? Was it a collective decision or guided by specialists? Did different groups maintain their own basins, or were the reservoirs communal? Archaeology cannot give us definitive answers, but these are the kinds of questions that emerge once we see Göbekli Tepe as more than an abstract ritual centre. It was also a managed environment where people solved practical problems together. The discovery of these features also changes how we imagine daily life on the hill. It suggests that alongside hunting and carving, people were engaged in water management. Children might have carried skins to fill basins, adults might have cut channels deeper after heavy rains, and the community as a whole would have depended on the hidden reservoirs beneath their feet. The monumental enclosures may dominate our imagination, but the life of the site was also lived in the simple act of drinking, washing, and keeping thirst at bay. There is a humility in recognizing how the most basic need, water, shapes the grandest projects. Göbekli Tepe's pillars could not have been raised without hydration for workers. Feasts could not have been sustained without something to wash down the roasted gazelle and aurochs, and social gatherings would have withered without the daily sharing of water. The carved channels, modest as they appear, were essential to the very possibility of community on that hilltop. As we consider these systems, a haunting question remains. Did they always suffice? Were there years when rainfall was low, when basins dried out, when people gathered only to face scarcity? Did water shortages contribute to the eventual decline of the site? Archaeology cannot yet answer these questions, but the possibility lingers. Water can sustain communities, but it can also undo them. The channels in the limestone remind us of both resilience and vulnerability. In the end, the water under the hill tells us that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not only visionaries carving monumental stones, but also practical engineers adapting to their environment. They managed the flow of rain, stored it in rock, and built systems that allowed them to stay longer, gather larger groups, and sustain the social life that made their monuments possible. The quiet grooves in the bedrock may never draw as many tourists as the towering pillars, but they deserve equal attention. They speak of foresight, cooperation, and the everyday ingenuity that underpins even the most extraordinary human achievements. What do necklaces say about a society that has not yet invented farming? The question seems simple, but it forces us to consider how people expressed themselves, organised their communities, and gave meaning to their lives in an age long before writing or settled agriculture. When archaeologists sift through the soil of Göbekli Tepe and other early Neolithic sites, they often come across the tiniest of finds, beads carved from stone, shell, and bone, sometimes only a few millimetres across. They lack the scale of a T-shaped pillar or a carved vulture, yet they carry enormous weight in understanding social identity. Adornment is never just decoration. It is communication worn on the body. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe have yielded thousands of such beads, many discovered in domestic contexts rather than monumental enclosures. They are made from a range of materials, including greenstone, limestone, and the bones of birds. The choice of materials reflects both availability and preference. Some stones could be collected locally from the plateau, but others had to be carried from considerable distances, indicating exchange networks or seasonal mobility. The very act of selecting a material hints at value. A glistening greenstone bead might have meant something different than a simple limestone one. The methods of production are also telling. Beads were not casual objects. To make one required careful drilling, often with fine stone or bone tools, and polishing to achieve symmetry and shine. Archaeologists have found half-finished beads, waste from drilling, and clusters of tiny fragments in domestic areas of the site. This suggests that bead making was a regular activity, likely undertaken around hearths where people gathered. One can picture individuals sitting by the fire in the evenings, grinding, drilling, and polishing tiny pieces while others prepared food or tended children. If these beads were purely utilitarian, their effort would be puzzling. They served no obvious practical function, like cutting or grinding. Their purpose was symbolic, aesthetic, and social. When strung into necklaces, sewn into clothing, or worn as pendants, they became markers of identity. Archaeologists often describe them as indicators of personal adornment, but behind that neutral term lies the deep human tendency to display who we are and where we belong. The presence of bead-making at Göbekli Tepe challenges older narratives that such symbolic expression only followed the invention of farming or the rise of hierarchical societies. Here, more than 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers who were only beginning to experiment with sedentary life already invested in ornaments. This shows that self-expression and social identity were not luxuries of advanced societies. They were part of the human package long before fields of wheat were cultivated. The diversity of beads also raises questions about style and group affiliation. In some cases, specific shapes recur: disc-shaped beads, tubular beads, animal tooth pendants. Such consistency suggests shared traditions of ornamentation. Did different households favour different styles? Did groups signal their membership through bead choices, much as modern people might use clothing brands or colours? We cannot know for certain, but the evidence points to variability that likely held meaning. Another layer of interpretation comes from burials found at other pre-pottery Neolithic sites. Individuals were often interred with strings of beads, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐼, bead necklaces appear to have been prized possessions. Though Göbekli Tepe has not yielded formal burials within its main enclosures, the presence of bead-making debris suggests that similar traditions of adornment were part of daily life. These necklaces would have been visible in gatherings, flashing in firelight or sunlight as people moved, hunted, or feasted. The role of beads in social signalling goes beyond personal vanity. They may have helped structure relationships in larger groups. In small foraging bands, everyone knows everyone else, and identity is obvious. In gatherings of dozens or hundreds, symbols become important. A necklace could indicate kinship, social role, or even achievements. It may also have served as a portable form of wealth. Unlike perishable goods, a string of beads could be carried, traded, or given as a gift, cementing social bonds. There is also the question of ritual use. Beads often appear in contexts that suggest ceremonial roles, placed carefully in pits, found near hearths, or clustered in association with special buildings. They may have been worn during communal events at Göbekli Tepe, serving as markers of participation or status. A necklace is both personal and public, intimate to the wearer but visible to all. Its dual role makes it a perfect medium for expressing belonging in a shared ritual. The artistry of bead making also deserves emphasis. When examined under microscopes, many beads show meticulous shaping, symmetrical perforations, and polished surfaces. The skill required would have taken years to master. Was bead making a specialized craft, or did many people learn it? The evidence of scattered production debris suggests it was not confined to an elite group, but was a widespread practice. Yet some beads are of such high quality that they hint at particularly skilled artisans. Here again we see the blend of the ordinary and the exceptional that characterizes so much of human creativity. Comparative evidence from other early sites strengthens the picture. At Ohalo II, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, dating back to 19,000 years ago, beads made of shells already appear, some transported from the Mediterranean coast. At Natufian sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and Hilazontaktit, elaborate bead necklaces were found buried with the dead. These precedents show that Göbekli Tepe did not invent adornment, but inherited and elaborated a long tradition. What changes at Göbekli Tepe is the scale and context, ornaments appearing in a large semi-sedentary community with monumental architecture rising nearby. The symbolic weight of beads becomes clearer when we consider their durability. Unlike feathers, flowers, or body paint, beads endure. A necklace could outlast its maker, be handed down through generations, or be buried as a treasured object. They became repositories of memory, carrying traces of people and events long gone. To wear a bead was to wear history, whether personal or communal. Of course, we must acknowledge our limits. We cannot ask the people of Göbekli Tepe what their necklaces meant. We can only infer from patterns, contexts, and comparisons. Some interpretations may be off the mark. Perhaps beads were valued for reasons we cannot imagine, reasons tied to beliefs lost in time. But what is certain is that they mattered enough for people to spend countless hours making them, stringing them, and wearing them. In a world of constant labour to find food and fuel, that investment alone speaks volumes. There is a quiet irony in how much effort modern archaeologists expend studying these tiny artefacts. Hours of microscopy, cataloguing, and classification are spent on items that could fit in the palm of a hand. Yet this patience mirrors the patience of the original makers, who drilled and polished grain-sized fragments into gleaming ornaments. Across 11 millennia, the act of staring closely at beads unites us, if only for a moment, with the people who first made them. So what do necklaces say about a society without farming? They tell us that identity mattered, that beauty mattered, that humans have always reached beyond subsistence to communicate who they are. Göbekli Tepe's beads whisper that even before cities, before fields of wheat, before livestock pens, people sat beside their fires and made things not for survival but for meaning. They remind us that the human story is not just about tools and food, but about symbols, style, and the desire to be seen. The haunting question, then, is simple. What stories were those necklaces telling that we will never hear? Were they love tokens, clan markers, ritual regalia, or all of these at once? We may never know, but the presence of beads at Göbekli Tepe ensures that behind the stone monument stood people who cared deeply about how they looked, how they belonged, and how they remembered. Were these animals food, gods, or both? That is the question that echoes through the carvings of Göbekli Tepe. The limestone pillars, weighing many tons and rising from circular enclosures, are covered with images. Some are abstract, geometric, and difficult to interpret, but many are recognizable creatures. Among the most prominent are foxes, vultures, and snakes. They are not random animals chosen from the landscape. Their repeated presence suggests a symbolic weight, a place in the cognitive world of the builders. And yet, as with all things in archaeology, certainty eludes us. When a vulture spreads its wings across a pillar, it is more than a bird in flight. At Göbekli Tepe, several carvings show vultures with outstretched wings, sometimes accompanied by headless human figures or abstract symbols. This imagery recalls practices documented much later in the Near East and Central Asia, where vultures were associated with excarnation, the deliberate exposure of bodies to birds of prey. In such traditions, vultures were not feared as scavengers, but revered as agents of transformation, carrying human souls from earth to sky. Archaeologists have long debated whether the vulture motifs at Göbekli Tepe signal early beliefs about death and the afterlife. It is tempting to connect the images with mortuary practices, though no direct evidence of such rituals survives at the site. Still, the prominence of vultures cannot be accidental. Foxes are equally striking. They appear again and again, sometimes running along the sides of pillars, sometimes shown in profile with sharp snouts and bushy tails. Foxes were part of the local fauna, hunted for meat and fur. But their frequency in the carving suggests something beyond dietary relevance. In later Mesopotamian mythology, the fox plays the role of trickster and messenger, a liminal figure moving between realms. Of course, it is anachronistic to project Bronze Age myths back onto the early Neolithic, yet the enduring resonance of the fox hints at qualities that people may have recognized even in those deep millennia: cunning, adaptability, the ability to survive at the edges of human settlements. At Göbekli Tepe, foxes may have symbolized qualities admired or feared, reminders that survival often depends on wit as much as strength. Snakes too coil across the stone. Their sinuous forms are depicted in relief, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. The snake has always been a potent symbol. In many cultures it embodies danger, transformation, or fertility. In the context of early Neolithic Anatolia, snakes may have represented the hidden dangers of the landscape, the creatures that lurked in grasses and burrows. Or they may have carried associations of renewal, shedding their skin as a metaphor for cycles of life and death. Archaeologists cannot know what a snake meant to the people of Göbekli Tepe, but the decision to carve it into enduring limestone suggests it carried more weight than a passing threat. One way to approach these carvings is through the lens of cognitive archaeology, the effort to reconstruct how ancient people thought and what they valued. It is not an easy task. We lack texts, oral traditions, or direct testimonies from the people themselves. Instead, we infer from patterns, comparing the frequency of motifs, their placement, and their associations. For instance, at Göbekli Tepe, animal figures are not scattered randomly but clustered in meaningful ways. Some enclosures favour particular species. Some animals are placed prominently on central pillars, while others are relegated to the margins. This distribution may encode narratives or categories of meaning. The emphasis on dangerous animals is striking. Alongside foxes, vultures, and snakes appear wild boar, scorpions, and large predators. These are not the gentle animals of pastoral life, but the creatures that could kill, bite, or sting. Some archaeologists argue that this focus reflects a worldview where power resided in the wild, in forces beyond human control. To carve these animals into stone was perhaps to acknowledge their power, to invoke it, or even to tame it symbolically. The enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, with their looming pillars covered in beasts, might have been spaces where people confronted the wild forces of their environment in communal rituals. But animals can be both practical and symbolic. Vultures cleaned carcasses, foxes raided food stores, snakes threatened and fascinated. The daily presence of these creatures would have made them constant figures in the imagination. At the same time, their depictions suggest they held roles in stories or beliefs. We may think of them as both food and gods, both threats and allies, woven into a symbolic system that blurred natural and supernatural. It is also worth asking why humans themselves are rarely depicted. When they do appear, they are often abstract or incomplete. Headless bodies, arms and hands without faces. By contrast, animals are rendered with detail and vitality. This imbalance suggests that the animal world carried special importance. Perhaps humans saw themselves as defined by their relationship to these creatures, measuring themselves against the fox's cunning or the vulture's dominion over death. Or perhaps animals were stand-ins for spirits, ancestors, or forces of nature. Comparisons with nearby sites provide some support. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, another early Neolithic settlement in southeastern Turkey, Similar pillar carvings include snakes and birds. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴 and Muribet on the Euphrates, animal imagery appears on stone plaquettes. This continuity suggests a shared symbolic repertoire across the region, a cultural language of animals that people use to express ideas too large for words. Still, we must remain cautious. It is easy to project modern symbolism backward. A fox may be clever to us, but to the people of Göbekli Tepe, it may have meant something entirely different. A vulture may inspire dread in modern minds, but it could have been a revered guide in theirs. Archaeology teaches humility. We can outline possibilities, build arguments from patterns, but we cannot claim final answers. The fox and the vulture thus remain haunting figures. They stare from the stone across millennia, challenging us to understand. Were they guardians of the enclosures, symbols of clans or lineages, emblems of stories now forgotten? The power of these carvings lies in their ambiguity. They show us that more than 11,000 years ago, people were already shaping complex symbolic worlds, where animals stood at the threshold of myth and reality. And so we return to the question, were these animals food, gods, or both? The truth may be that they were all of these at once. For the people who carved them, the boundaries between sustenance, danger, and spirituality were not as rigid as ours. To eat an animal, to fear it, and to honour it could coexist. The fox that raided a storehouse could also embody the spirit of cunning. The vulture that picked clean a corpse could also carry the soul to the sky. The snake that bit in the grass could also embody renewal. In the end, the carvings at Göbekli Tepe remind us that animals were central to the human story long before domestication. They were companions, adversaries, symbols, and teachers. And the haunting question that lingers is this: what stories did the people of Göbekli Tepe tell when they gathered in those circles of stone, surrounded by foxes, vultures, and snakes etched into the walls? Whatever those stories were, they mattered enough to be carved in stone, preserved for us to wonder at millennia later. Did Göbekli Tepe invent religion, or just carve it deeper? That question has lingered over the site from the moment archaeologists began to clear its enclosures of dust and debris. Popular headlines quickly called it the world's first temple, a place where belief itself was born, as though spirituality suddenly appeared along with limestone pillars. The truth, as always, is less dramatic and far more complex. Ritual is older than stone. Burial practices, painted caves, figurines carved from ivory, and ochre-stained skeletons testify that symbolic behaviour and ceremonies existed long before the 10th millennium years ago. But Göbekli Tepe offers something different. Here, ritual was inscribed into the landscape itself, in stone that would last for millennia. It did not invent belief, but it raised it onto an unprecedented scale. From the earliest excavations in the 1990s, the scale of the enclosures set Göbekli Tepe apart. Massive circular and oval spaces, ringed with T-shaped monoliths, some rising over 5 metres high and weighing up to 20 tons, spoke of coordinated effort. The pillars were carefully arranged, often with 2 larger monoliths standing at the centre of each circle facing one another. Archaeologists could not help but read these spaces as sanctuaries. The absence of hearths, storage bins, or everyday refuse in the deepest levels seemed to reinforce the interpretation. This was not, in its earliest levels, a village. It was something else. A place designed for gathering, for ceremony, for shared acts of meaning. Feasting appears to have played a central role. Archaeozoological studies of animal bones found within the site show evidence of large-scale consumption. Gazelle bones dominate the assemblage, many bearing cut marks and breakage patterns consistent with mass butchering. Aurochs, wild boar and red deer are also present, along with birds such as cranes and vultures. The sheer quantity suggests that hundreds of people may have been fed in single events. Such gatherings would have required planning, cooperation and organisation. Feasts are not just about eating. They create bonds, establish obligations and mark transitions. In the absence of permanent leaders or centralised states, feasting could have been the glue of early societies, a way to bring scattered groups together and forge alliances. The architecture itself reinforces this interpretation. The central pillars, carved with hands folded across the abdomen, appear almost anthropomorphic, as though representing beings who presided over the space. Surrounding pillars, decorated with animals and abstract symbols, may have been witnesses, guardians, or embodiments of the natural world. To step into one of these enclosures would have been to enter a symbolic cosmos, a world set apart from the mundane. The act of building and maintaining such spaces was itself a ritual, binding the community in shared labour. Initiation is another possibility. Some scholars have proposed that the enclosures were used for rites of passage, marking transitions from youth to adulthood, from outsider to insider. The restricted entrances, the towering monoliths, the images of dangerous animals, all could have created an atmosphere of awe and fear. Participation in ceremonies within these spaces may have reinforced social identity, teaching young members the stories, symbols, and values of their community. The effort of quarrying, carving, and erecting the pillars could itself have been part of the initiation, a demonstration of strength, cooperation, and belonging. The question of whether these enclosures were temples is ultimately a matter of perspective. The word temple carries baggage from later civilizations with their priests, altars, and hierarchies. Göbekli Tepe predates such institutions by thousands of years, yet in its broadest sense, a place set apart for communal acts of meaning, it fits. These were monumental ritual spaces, not private shrines. They were large enough to host crowds, impressive enough to inspire awe, and durable enough to embody continuity across generations. At the same time, it is important to resist the temptation of single explanations. Ritual at Göbekli Tepe was likely multifaceted. Feasts, initiations, storytelling, commemoration of the dead, seasonal gatherings, all may have taken place within these circles of stone. Each activity would have layered new meanings onto the site, building a cumulative tradition that lasted for centuries. One of the most intriguing aspects is the intentional burial of some enclosures. Archaeologists have found that after a period of use, certain circles were deliberately filled in with debris, broken stone tools, animal bones, and soil, before new ones were built nearby. This was not casual abandonment but purposeful closure. Such acts suggest that the enclosures were not meant to stand forever. They were used, honoured, and then ritually sealed, perhaps to mark the end of a cycle, the passing of a generation, or the completion of a narrative. The act of burial itself was a ritual, a way of transforming architecture into memory. What we see today is thus only the final layer of a long tradition. Earlier practices, now hidden beneath centuries of fill, may have been different in scale or purpose. But the pattern of renewal, of building, using, and burying speaks of a dynamic ritual life. Göbekli Tepe was not a static monument. It was a living theatre of meaning. The symbolic architecture extended beyond the enclosures themselves. Carved channels in the bedrock suggest that water was collected and managed. Storage pits, grinding stones, and communal areas point to preparations for gatherings. The entire site was an integrated landscape of ritual and subsistence, a place where the needs of the body and the needs of the spirit were met together. Did Göbekli Tepe invent religion? Number ritual, belief, and symbolic behaviour are far older, but it did carve religion deeper into the earth than ever before. It gave belief a new materiality, a weight, and permanence in stone. It created a space where meaning was not just spoken or enacted, but inscribed, visible to all, enduring across centuries. It was, in that sense, a turning point, not the birth of religion, but its monumentalization. And yet the haunting question remains, why here, and why then? What compelled groups of hunter-gatherers, without domesticated animals or metal tools, to devote such energy to building circles of stone on a hill in southeastern Anatolia? Was it competition among groups, each seeking to display their strength and secure allies? Was it a shared response to changing climates and resources, a way to reinforce bonds in uncertain times? Or was it simply an outpouring of creativity, an early recognition that humans are meaning-making creatures who cannot live by bread alone? The answers may never be final. Archaeology offers evidence, but interpretation requires humility. As scientists, we can trace patterns, weigh possibilities, and compare contexts, but we cannot step inside the minds of those who carved the fox, the vulture, and the snake. What we can say is that Göbekli Tepe was a place where ritual took centre stage, where stone became a medium for belief, and where communities gathered not just to survive, but to create meaning. Perhaps that is the most important legacy of Göbekli Tepe. It shows us that more than 11,000 years ago, people were already building worlds of meaning as carefully as they built walls of stone. The enclosures were not only spaces for ritual, but monuments to the human impulse to connect, to celebrate, to mourn, and to wonder. In their silent stones, we glimpse not the invention of religion, but its first monumental expression, a reminder that the search for meaning is as old as humanity itself. And so we are left with the haunting question: when the builders of Göbekli Tepe gathered in those circles surrounded by pillars and carvings, did they feel that they had invented something new, or did they feel that they were simply carving deeper into truths that had always been with them? Why did people bury their greatest buildings under rubble? It is one of the strangest mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, and it lingers over the site like a question that refuses to fade. Across the broad limestone ridge, enclosures that had been carefully designed, laboriously built, and ritually used for centuries were eventually filled with broken stones, shattered tools, fragments of animal bone, and earth. These were not the slow accumulations of natural erosion. They were deliberate acts of closure. The people who had once raised the great T-pillars now covered them, entombing their own achievements beneath tons of debris. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not only about its rise, but about its burial. The timeline of this filling belongs to the later phases of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, roughly between 8,800 and 8,200 years ago. By then, the site had already seen centuries of use. Generations had gathered, feasted, carved, and renewed its enclosures. Then, for reasons still debated, the people who maintained this hilltop began to backfill its monumental structures. The image is strange to us because we usually associate monuments with permanence. We assume that something built with such effort was intended to last forever. Yet the evidence shows that permanence was not the point. Instead, cycles of building and burying were central to the story of this place. The fill itself is a kind of archive. Archaeologists have documented that the material used to bury the enclosures is not uniform. It consists of limestone rubble, broken into manageable pieces, mixed with an enormous quantity of cultural debris, flint flakes from toolmaking, bones from butchered animals, fragments of grinding stones, and even fragments of earlier pillars. It looks less like clean soil, and more like the residue of everyday life, deliberately gathered and poured into the spaces. If the enclosures had been abandoned naturally, we would expect wind-blown sediments or gradual collapse. Instead, what we see is a rapid, purposeful infilling. Some enclosures were sealed while their central pillars still stood upright. Others were already in partial ruin before being covered. In both cases, the decision to bury them was unmistakable. Why? Several interpretations have been proposed, each with strengths and uncertainties. One line of thought sees the backfilling as ritual closure. Just as the enclosures were built for communal meaning, so too were they retired through communal acts. Covering a space with debris may have marked the end of its symbolic role. The fill, rich with the remains of daily life, could have been a kind of offering, a way of embedding the activities of the community into the very soil of the site. In this reading, burial was not destruction but transformation. The enclosures were not erased, they were sealed, perhaps to preserve their potency for the ancestors or the spirits. Another possibility is practical. The enclosures, with their deep cuttings into the bedrock and massive stone uprights, may have been difficult to maintain as they aged. Once cracks formed or pillars leaned, rebuilding might have been less feasible than starting anew. In this case, filling the old structures could have been a form of stabilizing the hilltop before constructing new enclosures nearby. The fill would then serve as both burial and foundation, a way of recycling space while respecting what had come before. Some researchers have suggested ecological or social pressures as part of the explanation. By the early 9th millennium years ago, the societies of Upper Mesopotamia were changing. Farming of cereals was beginning to spread, and domesticated animals were becoming part of daily life in nearby regions. Settlements were growing, and with them came new forms of social organisation. Perhaps the large-scale gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were no longer sustainable, or no longer necessary. The decision to bury the enclosures could have marked the end of an era, the closure of a lifestyle that was being replaced by new modes of living. In this interpretation, the fill becomes a kind of farewell, a symbolic sealing of the hunter-forager world. Whatever the reasons, the act of burial must have been monumental in itself. Imagine hundreds of people carrying baskets of stone, dumping flint shavings, piling bones into pits, layering debris until pillars 5 meters tall disappeared from view. This was not a single afternoon's work. It was a project that may have stretched over seasons, involving coordination and shared intention. If building the enclosures created community, so too did burying them. The process itself would have been a ritual, a final gathering before the end. The idea of intentional closure is supported by parallels at other Neolithic sites. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and GÖBEKLI, archaeologists have found buildings that were carefully decommissioned, sometimes with burials or symbolic deposits placed inside before being sealed. The pattern suggests that dismantling and burying was a widespread practice in the Neolithic Near East, not unique to GÖBEKLI TEPE. In each case, closure seems to have been as important as construction. Buildings were not left to decay, they were given endings. This challenges our assumptions about permanence. For these communities, the act of closing a building may have carried as much meaning as the act of creating it. Of course, not every researcher agrees. Some argue that the fill could represent less ritualized processes. Perhaps the enclosures had simply lost their function, and the debris represents opportunistic dumping of waste into abandoned spaces. The presence of flint chips and animal bones, after all, could be consistent with refuse disposal. Yet the sheer scale and speed of the infilling, along with the mixture of materials, makes casual dumping unlikely. Few archaeologists today doubt that the backfilling was deliberate, though debate continues over its exact meaning. There is also the question of memory. By burying their own monuments, the builders of GÖBEKLI TEPE ensured that future generations would not forget them. The enclosures were not dismantled, not erased, but preserved beneath layers of debris. In a sense, they were entombed like relics, and that is exactly why they survived for archaeologists to rediscover thousands of years later. Whether or not the builders foresaw that, they ensured the preservation of their work by covering it. Perhaps for them the buried enclosures became part of the hill itself, a hidden archive of their identity. What is striking is how final it seems. After the 8th millennium years ago, the great monumental tradition of GÖBEKLI TEPE ends. There are no new enclosures built of the same scale. The hilltop that once rang with the sounds of feasting, quarrying and carving fell silent. Domestic architecture continued in the region, and farming expanded, but the great ritual centre was over. The act of burial marks a boundary in time. Before, a world of gathering hunter-foragers. After, a world of settled farmers and villages. GÖBEKLI TEPE was not a beginning but an ending, the last flourish of a tradition that had defined its people for centuries. And so the haunting question persists. Why bury greatness? Was it reverence for the past, a way of preserving what was sacred? Was it necessity, driven by practical concerns of safety or space? Was it social transformation, the symbolic closure of one way of life to make room for another? Archaeology offers us the traces of the act, but not the motives. What we can say is that the burial was deliberate, large-scale and meaningful. It was not neglect, but intention. It speaks of a people who cared enough about their monuments to end them properly. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that permanence was never the goal. For the builders of GÖBEKLI TEPE, meaning lay not only in what was raised, but in what was sealed. They created, celebrated, and then entombed. Their monuments were cycles, not static objects, and in that cycle lies a truth we too easily forget. Sometimes the most powerful statement is not in what we leave standing, but in what we choose to bury. Was GÖBEKLI TEPE alone, or part of something bigger? That question rises the moment you stand above its ring of stones and realize no community, no matter how skilled, lives in total isolation. Human groups share, imitate, borrow, and compete. They always have. The enclosures at GÖBEKLI TEPE are astonishing, but they do not exist in a vacuum. Over the past few decades, archaeology has revealed that this hilltop was one star in a larger constellation of early Neolithic sites across Upper Mesopotamia, a cultural zone today often called the Taş Tepeler region, the land of stone hills. To understand GÖBEKLI TEPE is to place it within this wider landscape of neighbours, experiments, and networks. When archaeologists speak of Taş Tepeler, They are referring to a cluster of mounded sites scattered across southeastern Turkey, especially in the Urfa region. These include Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan, and Çakmak Tepe. Along with the earlier known 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐿 further afield, the sheer density of these sites suggests that the upper Mesopotamian plain was not marginal or isolated at the end of the Pleistocene, but was instead a vibrant hub of human activity. If Göbekli Tepe has become the icon, it is partly because of its preservation and its early excavation. Yet what is striking is that its monumental traditions were not unique. Across the hills, other communities were experimenting with similar ideas: carved pillars, special buildings, and new ways of organising space. Karahan Tepe has emerged in recent years as perhaps the most important counterpart to Göbekli Tepe. Located roughly 35 kilometres to the east, Karahan Tepe has revealed monumental architecture on a comparable scale. Excavations have uncovered T-shaped pillars arranged in enclosures, benches carved into bedrock, and reliefs that suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary. Yet Karahan Tepe also introduces differences. The most famous discovery there is a stone sculpture of a human figure with carefully carved facial features, set in a chamber flanked by upright pillars. Unlike the faceless T-shapes of Göbekli Tepe, here the human form is made explicit. The site also includes rows of phallic-shaped pillars, a detail both strange and unique, reminding us that each community developed its own local variations on shared themes. Karahan Tepe demonstrates that the monumental impulse was regional, not isolated, and that Göbekli Tepe was part of a network of communities experimenting with scale and meaning. 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, now lost beneath the waters of the Ataturk Dam, was excavated in the 1980s and offers another crucial piece of the puzzle. Long before Göbekli Tepe captured headlines, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 revealed a rectangular building with T-shaped pillars set within its walls, flanked by benches. Human and animal figurines were also found, suggesting a symbolic repertoire that resonates strongly with later discoveries. Unlike Göbekli Tepe, however, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 was a permanent settlement with clear domestic architecture, storage facilities, and evidence of farming. This means that the monumental pillar tradition did not belong solely to mobile hunter-foragers, but was carried into early farming villages as well. If Göbekli Tepe represents the apex of pre-agricultural monumentality, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 shows us the tradition continuing in a different context. Sayonu, further east near Diyarbakir, pushes the story in another direction. This site was occupied for centuries through multiple architectural phases, from round huts to rectangular stone buildings. Among its most striking features is a so-called skull building, containing deposits of human remains and a long sequence of innovations in domestic architecture. While Sayonu lacks the iconic T-pillars of Göbekli Tepe, it belongs to the same broad cultural world. Here we see the evolution of sedentary life, storage, and eventually domestication of animals, unfolding alongside experiments in ritual architecture. It reminds us that monumentality was only one part of a wider social transformation. What ties these sites together is not uniformity but dialogue. Each community carved its own path, but they shared ideas, techniques, and perhaps even people. The quarries of Göbekli Tepe, the stone sculptures of Karahan Tepe, the benches of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, and the skull deposits of Çayonu all point to a regional conversation about how to shape stone, how to mark space, and how to anchor meaning in architecture. The presence of obsidian artifacts at Göbekli Tepe, sourced from faraway quarries in eastern Anatolia, underscores that these were not isolated villages. Goods, raw materials, and probably stories moved across the landscape. If we step back and consider the wider Fertile Crescent, the picture grows richer still. Sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 on the Euphrates, with its circular communal buildings, and Muribet, with its early sequences of plant exploitation, show that communities across Syria and Turkey were experimenting in parallel. The monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were extraordinary, but they were part of a continuum. The transition from mobile groups to sedentary communities was not the story of one genius site. It was the story of an entire region, with many centres of innovation. The danger, as always, is to let one site overshadow the rest. Because Göbekli Tepe is visually dramatic, with its soaring stone pillars, it has captured the popular imagination. Media headlines turned it into the world's first temple, as if it appeared out of nothing, yet the evidence shows otherwise. The Taş Tepeler region was alive with creativity. Göbekli Tepe is famous because it was preserved and excavated, but countless other mounds may still hide equally complex structures. In that sense, our current picture is incomplete. What lies beneath the unexcavated hills could radically change how we see the whole story. This raises an important question. Was there a unifying culture behind these sites, or were they independent communities experimenting with similar solutions? Archaeologists debate the degree of connection. Some emphasize a shared symbolic vocabulary, pointing to the recurrence of T-shaped pillars, benches and relief carvings. Others stress the local differences, reminding us that even within 100 kilometers, traditions varied. Perhaps the best way to think about it is as a cultural horizon, a broad world in which communities shared ideas but did not conform to a single blueprint. It was not an empire or a unified religion, but a patchwork of communities connected by networks of exchange and occasional gatherings. This perspective also helps us reconsider the significance of Göbekli Tepe itself. If it had been truly unique, it might have been easier to dismiss as an anomaly. But placed in the context of Karahan Tepe, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 and Tayo, it becomes the most spectacular expression of a much wider tradition. Its importance lies not only in what was built on that one hill, but in how it illuminates a whole region at a pivotal moment in human history. There is something humbling in realizing that Göbekli Tepe was not alone. It reminds us that no breakthrough, however dramatic, belongs to a single place or people. Human innovation is always networked. Ideas emerge in clusters, carried by conversations, exchanges, and shared challenges. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were extraordinary, but they were also participants in a broader dialogue stretching across the Fertile Crescent. And so, the haunting question remains. If Göbekli Tepe is the star we can see, how many others are hidden beneath the hills still waiting? The landscape of southeastern Turkey is dotted with mounds, many unexplored. Each one could hold another piece of the story, another experiment in stone, another glimpse into the minds of people living 11,000 years ago. For now, we work with fragments, but even these fragments tell us that Göbekli Tepe was part of something larger, a conversation across valleys and rivers about how humans should live, gather, and remember. What do you call people who harvest plants, but do not farm them? That question unsettles the neat categories we are often taught. Hunter-gatherer on one side, farmer on the other. Yet in the millennia when sites like Göbekli Tepe were built, the people of Upper Mesopotamia fit into neither box. They were neither wandering in constant pursuit of game, nor cultivating crops in ploughed fields. Instead, they inhabited the long, ambiguous middle ground. Archaeologists sometimes call this the broad-spectrum revolution, or pre-domestication cultivation. Whatever the name, it describes a mode of life in which humans managed landscapes, harvested wild cereals, and perhaps even sowed seeds, without having yet crossed the line into formal agriculture. The concept of the broad-spectrum revolution was proposed in the 1960s by Kent Flannery, who noticed that as the Ice Age ended, humans began to exploit a far greater variety of species. Instead of relying heavily on large game like gazelle or aurochs alone, they increasingly gathered wild grains, pulses, tubers, small mammals, birds, and fish. This diversification was not random. It was a deliberate strategy to stabilize food supplies in an unpredictable environment. In practice, it meant pounding wild barley with stone pestles, collecting lentils from the hillsides, and roasting acorns in hearths. It meant people were becoming experts in dozens, even hundreds of species in their surroundings. At Ohalo 2, a lakeside site on the Sea of Galilee dated to around 23,000 years ago, long before Göbekli Tepe, charred remains of barley, wheat and other seeds show that people already experimented with grinding and cooking cereals. Microscopic analysis of stone tools revealed starch grains consistent with flour production. By the time of the Natufians, between 15 and 11,000 years ago, such practices had become more organized. Grinding stones were abundant. Sickle blades with polish from cutting grasses show that people were harvesting stands of wild cereals systematically. They were not planting fields, but they were investing serious labour in reaping what nature offered. The crucial shift came when people not only harvested wild cereals, but also began to manage them. Archaeologists use the phrase pre-domestication cultivation for this in-between stage. evidence from sites like Abu Huraira on the Euphrates and Tel Caramel in northern Syria suggests that people scattered seeds of wild barley or rye, cleared competing plants, and perhaps tended patches of grain near their settlements. These were still wild species, but human hands were shaping their growth. Over generations, such practices nudged evolution along. Plants with traits advantageous for humans, such as non-shattering seed heads, were favoured. Without any conscious plan, domestication was creeping closer. This kind of low-level cultivation had important consequences. First, it required staying in one place long enough to return to the same patch to harvest again. Mobility was constrained not only by architecture, but also by investment in local plants. Second, it changed the seasonal rhythm of life. Harvesting wild cereals was tied to specific months. This meant planning ahead, coordinating labour, and sometimes storing surplus. Third, it deepened knowledge of the landscape. People who had once roamed widely were now mapping microenvironments, knowing exactly where stands of einkorn or emmer wheat ripened best. In short, they were still foragers, but they were behaving in ways that foreshadowed farming. Göbekli Tepe and its neighbours were built during precisely this ambiguous period. Grinding stones at the site suggest that cereals were consumed in quantity. Yet archaeobotanical studies have not found evidence of fully domesticated crops in the earliest levels. What they have found are wild barley, einkorn, and pulses, plants harvested in bulk, processed, and perhaps even stockpiled. Large limestone basins may have been used for soaking or storing grain. The people gathering at Göbekli Tepe were clearly not subsisting on hunting alone. Their diets were broad, varied, and increasingly dependent on plants. Abu Huraira offers one of the clearest glimpses of this transition. Excavations in the 1970s revealed deposits spanning from the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐼c to the Neolithic. In the earlier levels, people relied heavily on gazelle, wild cattle, and gathered plants. By around 11,500 years ago, however, rye grains with non-shattering rachies appeared, an early sign of domestication. This was not yet full agriculture, but it showed that selective pressures from human harvesting were already altering plant populations. The inhabitants of Abu Huraira were still hunters and gatherers, but their gathering was transforming into cultivation almost without them noticing. Another site, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 in southeastern Turkey, shows a similar story. Dating to around 11,000 years ago, it preserves evidence of semi-subterranean houses, storage pits, and an economy based on hunting pigs and gathering plants. Here too, grinding stones and botanical remains suggest an increasing focus on cereals, though domesticated forms were absent. The people of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿𝐼 were still living without agriculture, yet they were preparing the ground for it in every sense. Why did this broad-spectrum foraging emerge? Part of the answer lies in climate. After the cold, dry, Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, conditions in the Fertile Crescent became warmer and wetter. Wild cereals grew in a dense stand on the slopes and plains. It would have been impossible not to notice that a day's work could yield baskets of grain. Another part of the answer lies in demography. As populations grew, hunting alone could not sustain everyone. By exploiting plants more intensively, communities could support larger groups without moving constantly. This shift was not simply about calories, it altered social life. Harvesting grain required cooperation. Whole groups cutting, threshing, and grinding together. Storage pits required trust and perhaps rules to regulate access. Meals of porridge or bread, even in rudimentary forms, created new kinds of commensality, eating the same foods from shared labour. These subtle changes laid the foundation for larger gatherings, for feasts, and for monumental projects like those on the Urfa Plateau. Without reliable access to plant foods, such endeavours would have been impossible. Yet it is important to stress what these people were not. They were not yet farmers. They did not plough fields or sow domesticated seeds in ordered rows. They did not rely on domesticated sheep or goats to fertilise their land. Instead, they lived in a long interim stage where wild and managed blurred together. They were neither pure foragers nor true cultivators. They lived in a state of low-level food production, as some archaeologists call it. This ambiguity is what makes the period so fascinating and so difficult to describe in our modern categories. The line between gathering and farming is not a single event, but a gradient stretched across centuries. To the people of 11,000 years ago, there was no such line. They were simply making do, adjusting, experimenting, and passing on knowledge. What they did not know was that their choices were setting in motion the most profound economic revolution in human history. By managing plants, they were domesticating themselves, tying their futures ever more closely to the rhythms of grain. And so the haunting question remains, at what point did they realize that they were no longer just foragers? Did the builders of Göbekli Tepe see themselves as people of the wild, living off what the land gave, or as something new, proto-farmers shaping the landscape to their will? We cannot know. What we can say is that they lived in the liminal space between two worlds, neither fully one nor the other. That ambiguity gave rise to some of the most extraordinary monuments of prehistory, built by people who were not yet farmers, yet no longer only foragers. Why did people stop building pillars and start painting walls? That is the question that hovers between the end of sites like Göbekli Tepe and the rise of new places such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒. Between about 8,800 and 8,000 years ago, something changed in the way humans chose to express themselves architecturally and ritually. Massive T-shaped monoliths, carved with predators and prey, gave way to mud brick houses whose walls carried paintings of hunters, cattle, and geometric patterns. The architecture shifted from monumental enclosures open to the sky to densely packed domestic blocks, each household carrying its own shrines. The transition was not simply one of building materials, but of worldview. 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, in central Anatolia, is often seen as the emblem of this change. Occupied for centuries beginning around 8,200 years ago, it consisted of tightly clustered houses pressed against one another without streets in between. People entered their homes through the roof, climbing down ladders into rooms with plastered walls and built-in platforms. At first glance, these seem like ordinary domestic spaces, yet on closer inspection they reveal an extraordinary investment in symbolic life. Bulls' horns were set into plastered walls, sometimes with modelled clay heads attached. Geometric wall paintings depicted grids, dots, and repeating forms. Other walls carried hunting scenes or images of vultures and headless human figures. If Göbekli Tepe was a world of giant stone pillars standing in communal enclosures, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 was a world of symbolism pressed into plaster within the intimacy of the home. The shift is striking. Why did people turn away from megaliths and toward painted walls? One explanation lies in the broader economic transformation of the time. By the end of the 9th millennium before present, farming communities had taken root across Anatolia and the Levant. Domesticated cereals and legumes were part of daily diets, and herds of sheep and goats were increasingly under human management. Life was more settled, more predictable, and more bounded by the household. In such a world, the household itself became the primary arena for ritual and symbolism. Where earlier communities gathered to raise great stones, later ones painted the walls of their own rooms, embedding ritual directly into domestic life. Another explanation lies in the changing scale of society. At Göbekli Tepe, large gatherings of people likely came together periodically for feasts and building events. The architecture demanded cooperation on a vast scale. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, the scale narrowed. Each family or extended household maintained its own ritual space. Bulls' horns were set not in communal enclosures, but in the plaster of one's own home. Ritual became decentralized, woven into the everyday fabric of living rather than staged in monumental communal settings. The effect was a democratization of ritual expression. Everyone could participate not only in the shadow of stone giants, but in the intimacy of their own hearth. The art itself also changed. At Göbekli Tepe, carvings emphasized wild animals. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, paintings and reliefs often focused on cattle, now increasingly domesticated. This shift reflects not only a new economic reality, but also a new symbolic vocabulary. The aurochs, once a beast of the wild hunted in dangerous pursuit, became the bull, a creature tied to human herds, its horns fixed in plaster as enduring symbols. Scenes of hunting persisted, but they were no longer carved into stone pillars. They were painted in red and black on mud brick walls. The materials changed, the settings changed, and perhaps the meanings changed too. One of the most famous wall paintings at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 shows what some interpret as a map, a grid of squares topped by a double-peaked mountain, possibly representing Hassan Dar, a nearby volcano. If this interpretation is correct, it would be among the earliest known maps in the world, showing not only the layout of the settlement, but also the looming presence of the landscape. Even if the painting is not a map, it demonstrates the inventive visual culture that flourished within these homes. Burials at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 add another layer to the story. The dead were often interred beneath the floors of houses, wrapped in mats or cloth. Sometimes bodies were removed later, with skulls retrieved and reburied separately. This practice echoes earlier traditions in the Levant, where skull retrieval was part of ancestor veneration. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, however, it was integrated into household life, quite literally underfoot. The houses were not just places to live, but places to connect with ancestors, to embed memory and ritual into the walls and floors of everyday existence. This change from monumental to domestic ritual raises larger questions. Did the decline of sites like Göbekli Tepe mark the end of communal, supra-household ritual traditions? Or did those traditions simply move inward? Was 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒 a continuation of the same impulse to embed meaning in built space, only in a different form? The truth is that we cannot draw a sharp line. Instead, we see a spectrum of practices, from enclosures of stone to rooms of plaster, from carvings of predators to paintings of cattle. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as a shift from special buildings to ritual households. The terminology underscores that ritual did not disappear after the monumental phase. It merely changed venue. Instead of towering pillars, ritual found its place in painted walls and buried ancestors. Instead of wide communal gatherings, it played out in repeated household acts, replastering a wall, renewing a bull's horn, repainting a geometric motif. Over centuries, these acts accumulated into a dense ritual landscape contained within the fabric of domestic life. The reasons for this shift may also be environmental and economic. As farming spread, people may have felt less need for large-scale seasonal gatherings tied to hunting and foraging. The rhythms of agriculture were steadier, tied to sowing and harvest, and the surplus of food supported denser settlements like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒. In such settings, ritual could be embedded in daily routines rather than expressed through monumental gatherings. The change may have been gradual, with overlapping practices across regions, but the outcome was clear. The centre of symbolic life moved from hilltop enclosures to household walls. For those of us today, the contrast is vivid. On one side, pillars of stone rising against the sky, carved with wild beasts. On the other, mud brick rooms, plastered and repainted, filled with horns and paintings. The former feels alien and otherworldly. The latter, oddly familiar. Perhaps that is the point. As humans moved further into the Neolithic, their symbolic lives became more domesticated, more like our own. The houses of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, with their cluttered rooftops and painted walls, feel closer to our modern notion of home than the stark enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. Yet both belong to the same long arc of human creativity, expressing changing relationships with animals, plants, ancestors, and each other. The haunting question, then, is whether something was lost in this transition. Did the end of monumental stone building represent a decline in communal imagination, or did it represent a gain in everyday intimacy? Were the people of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 living with more meaning embedded in daily life, or less? We cannot know their feelings, but we can observe the outcomes. The disappearance of carved pillars, the rise of painted walls, and the embedding of ritual within the house itself. Did Göbekli Tepe's pillars become humanity's first gods? That is a question that has lingered since Klaus Schmidt first brushed the dust from those great limestone T-shapes. For centuries before written myth, and long before bronze figurines or temple idols, people carved animals, symbols, and human arms into stone columns and set them upright in circles. They were not just posts, they were anthropomorphic beings, silent presences that dominated space and demanded attention. By the time the monumental enclosures were filled in around 8,800 years ago, the tradition of carved pillars had already set in motion something that would ripple across the Near East for millennia. The shift from monoliths to gods was not abrupt, but the echoes are unmistakable. The pillars themselves are peculiar because they are not merely decorated stones. Many of them bear stylized arms folded at the sides, sometimes with belts and loincloths, as if the pillars were human-like forms turned to stone. They were not carved as animals or as abstract symbols alone. They were carved as entities. To stand within one of the great circles of Göbekli Tepe was to stand among presences, figures that may have been understood as ancestors, spirits, or early gods. Archaeologists remain careful in their wording, but the fact remains that these are some of the earliest clear representations of anthropomorphic beings given monumental form. As the centuries passed and the monumental phase ended, the anthropomorphic impulse did not vanish. Across the Fertile Crescent in the 8th and 7th millennia before present, smaller figurines made of clay and stone appear in houses and shrines. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒𝐿, the famous seated woman figurine, and countless other human-like forms suggest continuity of a symbolic tradition. Instead of pillars carved in limestone, people now shaped gods and ancestors in clay, small enough to hold in the hand. The medium changed, the scale changed, but the impulse remained, to give shape to presences beyond the everyday, to bring beings into being through craft. The transition from pillar to god can also be seen in how humans conceptualized the sacred. At Göbekli Tepe, the sacred was embedded in architecture, in the towering enclosures themselves. In later Neolithic settlements, sacredness shifted toward portable objects and figurines. This allowed ritual and symbolism to become more personal and more widely distributed. Rather than gathering around pillars that required entire communities to raise, people could create and carry figurines in their own households. In this way, the concept of sacred beings became democratized, expanding from hilltop circles into the daily spaces of life. This does not mean the figurines were simple idols in the later sense. Their uses were diverse. Some were broken deliberately, some buried with care, some placed in prominent positions, others discarded. The ambiguity mirrors the pillars themselves, which may have been simultaneously architectural supports, symbolic presences, and focal points of gatherings. What matters is that humans in this period were consistently giving form to beings beyond themselves, shaping the earliest steps toward pantheons and mythologies. It is also important to note that this was not confined to one region. Across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, figurines proliferated. Some depict corpulent female figures often interpreted as fertility symbols, though interpretations remain contested. Others depict animals, sometimes hybrids, blurring the boundary between human and beast. The tradition of making beings in material form was spreading, adapting and diversifying. The monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe may have been abandoned, but the symbolic imagination they embodied had found new outlets. The question of gods emerges here. Were these beings gods in the way later civilizations would recognize them? It would be too simple to say yes. The people of the early Neolithic left us no texts, no prayers, no myths carved into stone. What they left are forms, but forms matter. To carve a pillar with arms is to say that something more than stone stands there. To mould a figure in clay is to suggest presence and agency. These are the seeds of gods, not yet named, not yet narrated, but embodied. When we later see the emergence of formal pantheons in Sumerian or Egyptian traditions, we are witnessing a continuation of a process that began long before writing. The great gods of Uruk or Memphis did not appear out of nothing. They grew from deep traditions of giving shape to the unseen. The leap from Göbekli Tepe's anthropomorphic pillars to the great statues of Inanna or Ra is vast in time and culture, yet the underlying human act is continuous, creating presences, embodying power, making gods. The persistence of certain motifs strengthens this sense of continuity. The vulture, prominent at Göbekli Tepe, appears again in Neolithic art of the Levant, associated with excarnation rituals. The bull, once carved on pillars, dominates shrines at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿. Serpents recur again and again across the region. These animals move from carved reliefs to figurines to mythic symbols. In later Mesopotamian myth, bulls become linked with storm gods, snakes with chaos, birds with heavens. The symbolic vocabulary of the early Neolithic becomes the mythological grammar of later civilizations. It is tempting to overstate continuity, to draw a straight line from Göbekli Tepe's enclosures to the temples of Uruk. But the truth is more complex. Traditions transform, break, and recombine. What we can say with confidence is that Göbekli Tepe demonstrates the earliest large-scale effort to materialize beings in stone, and that later Neolithic communities continue to materialize beings in clay and plaster. The impulse persisted, even as the forms changed. The haunting question is whether the people of Göbekli Tepe already thought of their pillars as gods, or whether gods as we understand them only emerged later. Were the pillars worshipped, feared, or simply recognized as presences? We cannot know. But what we can see is that, after the enclosures were filled in, the human drive to shape presences did not stop. Instead, it found new media, smaller scales, and eventually new names. Out of stone pillars grew clay gods, out of silent forms grew myths, and out of these myths grew civilizations. Why did Klaus Schmidt call Göbekli Tepe a supernova, and what in his words had burned out? This phrase has been repeated so often in books, documentaries, and conference papers that it now carries the weight of a legend. A single word from a German archaeologist who had spent much of his career in the dust of the southeastern Turkey became shorthand for the way we now talk about one of the most puzzling sites ever unearthed. Schmidt was not careless with words. He understood the risk of metaphors in science, how they could capture the imagination while simultaneously distorting it. Yet he reached for that word deliberately, because what he saw on that limestone ridge seemed to him both dazzling and terminal, a light that had once burned brilliantly and then gone dark. Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe in the mid-1990s, when most of the academic world paid the mound little attention. It had been noted decades earlier, misidentified as a medieval cemetery and largely ignored. The tell was dotted with flint fragments, the sort of debris found at countless other prehistoric sites. Yet Schmidt, with his training in Near Eastern prehistory and his years of work at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, recognised that these surface hints suggested something extraordinary below. When excavation began in earnest, the pillars emerged, one after another, their carvings sharp despite their burial under tons of sediment. For Schmidt, this was not a minor site to be catalogued. It was, as he told colleagues, a discovery that shifted the very framework of how we thought about prehistory. To call it a supernova was to emphasise both its brilliance and its isolation. A supernova shines brighter than all other stars for a brief moment, then collapses, leaving only remnants. Schmidt's framing suggested that Göbekli Tepe represented a spectacular flowering of a monumental architecture and symbolic expression that had no direct continuation. Unlike later temple traditions, it did not lead to continuity in form. The enclosures were deliberately filled, the pillars hidden, the tradition of megalithic enclosures not carried forward in the same way. For him, this was a burst of human creativity and organisation, dazzling in scale, but one that ended as suddenly as it appeared. The metaphor caught fire in the public imagination. Journalists love superlatives, and a supernova in prehistory was irresistible. Headlines spoke of the world's first temple, of a site that had rewritten history. Television specials described Schmidt as having discovered the birthplace of religion. In bookstores, volumes bearing Göbekli Tepe's name appeared alongside works speculating about ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and cosmic alignments. For a brief period, it seemed the site was being asked to carry the weight of every unanswered question about human origins. This was both the success and the burden of Schmidt's metaphor. It made the site visible, but it also locked it into a narrative that archaeology struggles with. The narrative of firsts. First temple, first gods, first civilization. Archaeologists are wary of such framing because human history is rarely a matter of abrupt beginnings. Traditions emerge gradually, practices overlap, lifeways coexist. To call Göbekli Tepe the first of anything risks obscuring the long, slow processes that made it possible. Schmidt himself knew this. His careful publications often emphasize continuity with earlier traditions of architecture, subsistence, and symbolism. Yet in interviews, the word supernova was the one that stuck. What makes this phrase worth reflecting on is that it captures a paradox. Göbekli Tepe is both extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary in scale, in the sheer number of carved pillars, in the labour invested by communities that had not yet adopted farming. Ordinary in the sense that it did not arise out of nothing, but out of generations of people who were already building circular houses, grinding seeds, gathering for ritual, and carving smaller objects. The site shines like a beacon because it survived in stone, while countless wooden or clay predecessors vanished. the supernova we see may not be a singular star, but one bright flare in a sky full of other lights that have since gone out. Schmidt's own framing of the site as a ritual centre, a place of cult gatherings rather than daily habitation, also helps cement its mythic status. The image of hunter-gatherers travelling from across the Fertile Crescent to build and worship on this ridge fit the supernova metaphor. Yet as excavations continued after his death in 2014, the picture became more complicated. Evidence of domestic buildings, grinding stones, basins and hearths suggested people were living here, not just visiting. The image of Göbekli Tepe as an isolated temple complex began to fade. In its place emerged a vision of a settlement with both ritual and domestic life interwoven. In this sense, the metaphor of a supernova may also obscure the slow burn of a daily life that accompanied the dazzling monuments. Still, the phrase endures because it points to something real, the sense of rupture. After about 8,200 years ago, the great enclosures were filled, the tradition of carving T-pillars ended, and communities shifted toward new forms of expression. Wall paintings, figurines, and plastered skulls replaced monumental stone circles. The brilliance of the pillars did not evolve into larger and larger stone temples. It was abandoned. Something had burned out. Whether this was the exhaustion of a particular way of organizing ritual, or the environmental and social pressures of the time, we cannot say with certainty. But the image of light fading captures the archaeological reality. The tradition of Göbekli Tepe did not continue in its original form. The public, of course, was less interested in nuance. To call it a supernova was to confirm that this was the place where it all began, or ended, depending on the interpretation. Popular accounts still describe Göbekli Tepe as the birthplace of religion, or civilization's first temple. These are powerful headlines, but they flatten complexity. They suggest a single cause, a single spark, rather than a long interplay of climate, ecology, social networks, and human imagination. Archaeologists, for their part, continue to wrestle with how to communicate the significance of the site without feeding into oversimplifications. In this tension lies a lesson about archaeology itself. Every excavation produces two narratives: the slow, cautious narrative of stratigraphy, radiocarbon dates, and lithic typologies, and the fast, spectacular narrative of headlines and documentaries. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates how quickly the second can outpace the first. A phrase meant to capture both wonder and ephemerality became a banner for interpretations that the excavators themselves often cautioned against. It reminds us how fragile the balance is between communicating significance and creating myths. Perhaps, then, the haunting question is not whether Göbekli Tepe was a supernova, but whether archaeology itself is caught between stars and stories. Schmidt's metaphor was brilliant because it admitted both wonder and transience. The site dazzles us, but it also vanished. The monuments endure, but the lifeways that created them are gone. As with a supernova, what we see is a remnant, a light that travelled across 10,000 years to reach us, stripped of its context, beautiful and incomplete. In remembering Klaus Schmidt, we should take his metaphor not as a literal claim about beginnings or endings, but as an invitation to humility. A supernova blinds as much as it illuminates. Göbekli Tepe shines brilliantly in our understanding of prehistory, but it is only one star among many. To study it is to be dazzled, but also to ask what else has been lost in the night sky of the human past. What if Göbekli Tepe was not the birth of civilization, but instead the last monument of a world that was already ending? For nearly 3 decades since its rediscovery, the site has been framed as a starting point, the spark of religion, the first temple, the origin of complex society. Yet what happens when we turn the perspective around? When we ask not what began here, but what concluded? This haunting possibility is worth sitting with, because the enclosures on the limestone ridge may have been less a prologue to farming villages than an epilogue to the great age of hunters and gatherers. For tens of thousands of years, long before the stones of Göbekli Tepe were carved, humanity lived by moving across landscapes, harvesting what the seasons offered. It was a way of life that stretched back beyond memory, one that shaped our bodies, our tools, and our stories. In those millennia, the world was full of paths rather than boundaries, campsites rather than walls. to build permanent stone enclosures, to carve animals into pillars, to invest in architecture that would outlast the builders, these were not the ordinary behaviours of nomads. They were extraordinary acts, perhaps precisely because the world that had sustained those nomads was shifting beneath their feet. By the time the first great circles of Göbekli Tepe were raised, climate had warmed from the cold extremes of the Pleistocene. Herds of gazelle and aurochs still roamed, but their ranges were changing. Wild cereals were more abundant, but harvesting them required new rhythms of labour. Groups that had once moved with the seasons began to linger longer in favoured valleys. The foraging lifeway was still dominant, but it was under quiet strain. Seen in this light, Göbekli Tepe may have been less a birthplace than a farewell, a monument to the richness of a forager's cosmos at the moment when it was becoming unsustainable. This possibility reframes the site. The carvings of foxes, vultures, and snakes might not have been promises of a new religious order, but commemorations of a disappearing one. The gatherings that brought hundreds of people together may not have been the first steps toward urban society, but the last great assemblies of communities who would soon be transformed by farming. The deliberate burial of the enclosures, centuries after they were first built, reads differently through this lens. It becomes less the closing of one chapter in preparation for another, and more a ritual acknowledgement that a world was passing away. Such interpretations remind us how tempting it is to project our own categories backward. Civilization loves origin stories. We seek the moment it all began. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not building with our categories in mind. They were not setting out to create civilization. They were, in all likelihood, answering immediate concerns, sustaining ties between groups, negotiating new relationships with land and animals, expressing beliefs through images carved in stone. The fact that farming societies followed soon after may tempt us to see the site as the cause. Yet causation is slippery. The monument may just as well have been the closing act of a way of being that was soon to vanish. There is something profoundly human in this. Endings are often disguised as beginnings. We rarely know when a tradition is taking its last form. The foragers who carved the pillars may not have thought of themselves as ending anything. They may have imagined continuity. But archaeology allows us to see from a wider vantage point. Within a few centuries, the mode of life that had dominated since the dawn of Homo sapiens was eclipsed. Farming villages spread, plants and animals were domesticated, and the landscape filled with permanent settlements. Against that backdrop, Göbekli Tepe shines as a reminder of what came before. To call it the end of one world rather than the beginning of another is not to diminish its significance. On the contrary, it deepens it. For here we glimpse the final flowering of a hunter-gatherer worldview on a monumental scale, a world in which animals were not resources to be penned but beings worthy of depiction, and perhaps reverence, a world in which gatherings were not organised around harvest calendars, but around stories, rituals, and feasts drawn from the wild. When these pillars were raised, the forest of stone was still part of a forager's imagination. When they were buried, that imagination was already giving way to the fields of farmers. This interpretation also helps us resist triumphalist narratives. Civilization, with its cities and writing systems, is often cast as an inevitable ascent. Göbekli Tepe complicates that. If these enclosures represent an ending rather than a beginning, then farming did not emerge simply because people suddenly discovered progress. It emerged because older ways became untenable. The end forced new experiments. In that sense, the stones of Göbekli Tepe are not monuments to triumph, but to fragility. They remind us that human worlds can vanish, no matter how enduring they seem. There is a quiet melancholy in this. To stand at Göbekli Tepe today is to confront a paradox. We marvel at the survival of the pillars, yet we know they were intentionally buried by their makers. We praise the sophistication of the builders, yet their world no longer exists. We interpret the site as a beginning, yet it may have been a farewell. Archaeology often deals in fragments, but here the fragment feels like an elegy carved in stone, and so the haunting question lingers. What does it mean that humanity's last great hunter-gatherer monument was mistaken for civilization's first? Perhaps it means we're always telling ourselves stories of origins, even when the evidence speaks of conclusions. Perhaps it means we're uncomfortable with endings, preferring to translate them into beginnings. Or perhaps it means that beginnings and endings are inseparable, Two sides of the same historical moment. The flare of a supernova is both the death of a star and the birth of new elements. The circles of Göbekli Tepe may have been both the end of foraging and the seedbed of farming. What we know for certain is humbler. The stones were carved, raised, and buried. The people who did this lived in a changing landscape at the threshold of agriculture. Their reasons are lost to us. Our metaphors, supernova, first temple, last monument, are our attempts to grasp at meaning. None of them are final answers, and perhaps that humility is the truest way to close. Göbekli Tepe was an end, not a beginning. Yet in that ending we glimpse the resilience and creativity of people who faced a world in transition. The stones do not tell us why. They tell us that humans, at the edge of change, leave marks that endure. And so, as we finish the story of Göbekli Tepe, we return not to origins, but to endings. A hill that should not exist, filled deliberately by its builders, discovered millennia later by chance. Not the dawn of civilization, but the twilight of a forager's cosmos. The last great monument of a world that vanished, still whispering to us across 12,000 years. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.